Hello, good evening, and welcome to Appraising Apartheid, Career of a Concept. By career of a concept, I want to make this clear that this isn't a history of South Africa. This isn't a apartheid era South Africa stream, i.e. chronicling an event-based history from 1948 until 1994, as a lot of histories focused on this topic are. Rather, when I'm emphasizing the idea of career of a concept, I'm deliberately drawing an allusion to Paul Gottfried and talking about the concept of apartheid, the concept and the application. So the intellectual development, which led to the creation of apartheid, and policy as a result of this intellectual development. So the policy, the application, and the evolution of apartheid, and the antecedents of the idea. I recently did a stream on Rhodesia, which you can check out, and I was struck by an accusation that Ian Smith, the Prime Minister of Rhodesia, made against South Africa once he believed that Vorster in the late 1970s had betrayed the cause of Rhodesia. And the indictment was that South Africa would not support the Rhodesian system because South Africa would have wished to have exported the apartheid political system into Rhodesia. And Rhodesia was not an apartheid state. It represented itself as a gradualist state towards the gradual emancipation of blacks, even though had that actually been allowed to continue without foreign intervention, it's very unlikely that that would have ever been achieved. So from that basis, I was interested in exploring the topic of apartheid. Before researching this, I had a very rudimentary understanding of apartheid. I knew the basic chronology, and I knew all about the nature of apartheid as meaning segregation and the attempt to create the Bantustans or the homelands. But I didn't really know, embarking upon this topic, where it would lead me. I had no idea or any real preconception about the various takes I would have on apartheid, but it ended up being a far more interesting and a far more conceptual topic than discussing a subject like Rhodesia. Rhodesia, which was far more focused on the ideas of the British Empire, the awkward nature of not being a dominion, not being a colony, etc., and an alternative path to decolonization. When talking about apartheid, I'm struck by the various notions of apartheid, and indeed you can say the inherent contradictions in apartheid. When I'm discussing the concept of apartheid, it is linked to the concept of Afrikanerdom, the nation of Afrikaners within Africa. You can take a concept like Afrikanerdom and you can extend it to a whole wide range of terminology, the Volksstaat, the people state, the Boerstaat. And really, I think this illustrates a broader crisis of South African identity, whereby it was originally a crown dominion of Britain, forming in 1910 as the Union, and yet the Afrikanerdom was avowedly republican, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and yet at the same time widely considered a colonial regime in terms of taking over the various black lands in the East. Indeed, when you consider the whole idea of democracy as the progressive enfranchisement of more and more facets of society until the point that you eventually enfranchise foreigners and non-natives, which fundamentally erodes the idea of democracy belonging to the nation state. In the case of South Africa, you have the contraction of the franchise. You see the rejection of internationalism, the rejectionism of what essentially could be typified as Smutism after Jan Smuts with the 1948 election. You see the crisis of having to deal with the legacy of a Westminster system and trying to create a new identity, a new political conception for what it means to be South Africa. Indeed, many historians who vilify the whole state of apartheid, believe that 1948 is some sort of abject lesson in understanding that progressive gains that were supposedly going to be made under the Jan Smuts government could be undone, and you can see a regressive step towards the retraction of the franchise and the consolidation of white supremacy. A lot of the authors I'm leaning on tonight are going to use white supremacy extensively, and there's nothing I can do in terms of acknowledging their use of the terminology. But nevertheless, in terms of trying to understand the contradictions within the whole apartheid narrative, I focus on two ideas. One is Aya, or Eiger, depending on your archaic sort of variation of the Afrikaans. And then there's this notion of Baskap, which is mastery. I think Baskap as pertaining to South Africa and pertaining to the policies of the Prime Minister Stredom in particular, you can say is more indicative of a policy than the term white supremacy. Indeed, the reason I'm loathed to use the term white supremacy is that even though in a literal sense this actually applies here, it has become so overutilized by journalists in particular, so has to become fundamentally meaningless. Indeed, it's a intentional derogative thrown at people who have any sort of, you can say, nationalist inclinations. And so I would say that the usage, the academic usage of the term white supremacy is very much intended for an academic audience and not so much a general audience. Hence why I myself am drawn to the idea of Baskap as encapsulating a idea of mastery. But these concepts of Baskap versus Aya fundamentally represent separate things in terms of this idea of Afrikanerdom. Aya essentially means a sense of ownness, to own oneself, to own one's destiny. You can say the purest encapsulation in the modern day within South Africa of Aya is the Orania project, the idea that we are going to have our own white state within South Africa that we possess. In many senses, you can say that the project of apartheid was, ironically, an attempt to create an independent Afrikaner state out of South Africa. And this going back to the crisis of South African identity. Is it British? Is it Afrikaner? Is it black? Fundamentally, that's a question that South Africa is having to deal with even today. And this all comes back to the inception of Afrikaner identity, South African identity, and the, you can say, anticlimax that is the Boer War. But there is another aspect other than simply contrasting this idea of white domination or mastery with this idea of white separateness or owning the legacy, which is this fundamental contradiction in terms of conceiving of a system of separateness, a system of apartheid, which is apartheid, is Aya, to represent a conservative organic process of separate development, or does the reality conflict with that when it leads to a managerial total state as encapsulated with the reality of things such as the dumb pass? Against this, you can say, idea grounded in theology and utopianism. Indeed, one of the things that really struck me, focusing on the topic of South Africa, was how much I would need to delve into Dutch Reformed theology. Indeed, seeing that the idea of apartheid has its origins in Christian thinking, which I'm sure to many people with even a cursory understanding of Christianity may be very surprised at, but not those who, say, for example, know that Malan, the first National Party Prime Minister after 1948, was, of course, a Dutch Calvinist minister. I'm going to be focusing on a various sort of selection of sources tonight. And the first one I'm going to be reading from is Irving Hexham's The Irony of Apartheid. And this is just to provide a very sort of short context as for where the Afrikaners come from. Many Afrikaner historians trace the awareness of this distinct Afrikaner identity to a period shortly after the first white settlement appeared at Cape Town in the 17th century. Others have argued that despite hints of an earlier awareness of nationhood, Afrikaner identity did not really flourish until the British oppressed the Afrikaner people in the first quarter of the 19th century. Against these views, Professor von Jaarsveld a leading Afrikaner historian, has argued the impossibility of showing Afrikaner national spirit prior to 1875. He is convinced that the awakening of Afrikaner nationalism resulted from the first language movement in the late 1870s. This is an attractive argument, but Schroeder's, Gladstone, and Kruger shows it is difficult to argue for a nationalist movement which really showed unified Dutch-speaking South Africans prior to the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. The fact is that whatever the dreams of a few intellectuals, the Dutch-speaking populations of the Cape Colony, Orange Free State, and South African Republic were fragmented and at times mutually hostile, divided by competing economic and political interests. The rise of Afrikaner nationalism following the Second Anglo-Boer War evolved out of the particular situation of those white settlers in southern Africa, influenced by Dutch neo-Calvinist theories. The Dutch settlement of the southern tip of Africa began in 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck built a fort on the site of what is now Cape Town. He intended to secure the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope for the ships of the Dutch East India Company and to establish a base for supplying fresh water, meat, and vegetables. To fulfill these needs, a small number of settlers were gradually allowed to acquire farms around the fort. The original settlers were largely Dutch and a few Germans. They were joined in 1688 by a group of French Huguenots seeking refuge following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Gradually, these groups intermarried, eventually forming one, the Cape Dutch or the Boer population. In addition to the white settlers, a small number of African and Malay slaves were introduced to the settlement. They too interbred, some with each other, some with the small number of indigenous people known as the Hottentots, and others with their white masters in what is now known as the origin of the colored people. At first, the settlers spread inland until they reached a desert region. Then they migrated northwards along the fertile coastal strip until, in 1770, some 400 miles from Cape Town, they encountered for the first time a densely settled area occupied by Africans. Until they entered lands settled by Africans, the European settlers had progressively claimed vast areas which previously had been the hunting grounds of small bands of Khoisan peoples. The Khoisan numbered about 200,000 at the time of the first white settlement at the Cape, but the spreading white settlement destroyed them. Some died from exposure to European diseases against which they had no natural resistance. Others were exterminated by the settlers. The survivors were pressed into the service of white farmers. Consequently, the Europeans had encountered no serious opposition to their occupation of the Western Cape, leading them to believe they were entering essentially unoccupied land. Their confrontation with settler African groups prevented their continued expansion along the coastal strip and threatened their supremacy. Nonetheless, many Europeans saw in the African society a potential source of cheap labor and a possibility to increase their holdings of cattle through exchange or raids against African farmers. These Boer attitudes were legitimated by their belief that the Africans too were migrating into previously unoccupied land. Surely these savages in need of civilization had no more right to the land than the white settlers. Yet contemporary evidence indicates continuous African settlement in these areas of first contact for at least 1,400 years. Furthermore, these African societies, which the Europeans depicted brutal and totally without restraint, were actually organized. By 1795, the ideology of the French Revolution began to affect South African European society, and a number of revolts occurred against the rule of the East India Company. However, in September 1796, the British occupied the Cape to prevent its falling into French hands. In 1803, they returned the Cape to Dutch rule, and for a short period it was administered by the Progressive Batavian Republic, that being the state which was set up by Napoleon. But further hostilities in Europe caused the British to reoccupy the Cape in 1806 to secure the sea route to India. This occupation lasted over 100 years until the granting of effective self-government in 1910 and its final recognition in 1934. Emphasis on this idea of occupation we talk about the Batavian Republic. One of the justifications for the British, quote unquote, occupying the Cape Colony was the fact that the Dutch government changed hands during this period from the old Dutch Republic of the Stadtholders into a French-administered client state. The Stadtholder himself and the House of Orange went into exile, and they would eventually reclaim the Netherlands under the Kingdom of the United Netherlands in 1814, 1815. But it's interesting to consider that while the Dutch were able to retain some of their colonies, most notably the Dutch East Indies, the occupation, or you can say the trust of the British over the Cape Colony became permanent. And you can say from the British this was a necessity owing to the fact that we don't have major infrastructure projects such as the Suez Canal until 60 years later. Faced with the expense of a series of frontier wars between Boer farmers and Africans, the British introduced a sizable British settlement to the Eastern Cape in the vicinity of Grahamstown in 1820. These British people were intended to make the frontier area more productive economically and therefore easier to defend. In practice, they became a human barrier between warring Africans and Boers. The sufferings and death of the British settlers were immense before a stable frontier was established. These settlers originated the English-speaking population of white South Africa, now about 40% of the entire population. Throughout the early part of the 19th century, tensions mounted between frontier farmers and missionaries of the London Missionary Society. These missionaries worked mainly with the coloured population and with white and with Africans working on European farms. Opposed to the way the farmers treated their servants and neighbouring Africans, the English missionaries accused the Boers of cruelty to their servants and of provoking wars with the Africans to gain cattle and land. These complaints, dismissed as unfounded by the settlers, were heard with great interest by evangelical leaders in England whose influence in Parliament was growing. As a result of these charges made by the missionaries, English pressure forced the British administration in Cape Town to seek justice on the frontier. Attempts of British officials to administer the law regardless of race and social standing, and their willingness to credit the allegations of missionaries, angered the frontier farmers. Interesting to note, people who are familiar with the end of apartheid, in addition, obviously, to the cult of personality built up around Nelson Mandela, there is, of course, the consideration of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Of course, he was an Anglican bishop of Cape Town. Interesting to contrast this idea of English Anglican missionaries and ultimately the Dutch Reformed tradition, both Christian, but you can say fundamentally at odds throughout various parts of the history. And indeed, you can say this missionary zeal and international condemnation of the Boer settlers' situation in South Africa is something which marks the beginning of the interrelation between the Dutch and the British, and indeed the end, when we talk about the end of apartheid. These tensions were fomented by the British decision to abolish slavery throughout lands under British control, and this would have been implemented during the time of William IV, so the 1830s. In South Africa, the slave population was small, but slaves represented the major capital investment of many small farmers. Arrangements for emancipation included compensation, but because of the influence of the great plantation owners in the West Indies, many of whom lived in Britain, compensation was to be paid to Britain. Consequently, most slave owners in South Africa lost their slaves without compensation. Naturally, this caused even greater unrest among the farmers. To ease the transition from slavery to freedom, the Cape administration introduced an apprenticeship scheme, which meant that slaves would remain under the control of their masters until 1838, when they would be free to move wherever they wished. Envisioning vast hordes of unemployed and bitter ex-slaves roaming the colony at will, the frontier farmers migrated en masse into the lands over which the British claimed no jurisdiction. The migration began in 1835, continued until 1838, is known as the Great Trek. So, fundamentally, a consistent theme, not just of the Boers, but indeed the Dutch, coming up with Prime Minister Kuyper, who I'm going to be discussing at length here, is the association with Britain as an imperial force, but also imperialism being associated with liberalism. Hence, the South Africans, the Afrikaners, are looking at the British essentially intervening with the abolition of slavery as a means to further extend British influence and control. Indeed, when we see the beginning of the Great Trek, essentially, it is this desire to liberate themselves from the British and embark into lands which are far more hostile than the experience of the Boer Dutch populations between 1654 and 1770, when, apart from a few Khoiser settlers, there was effectively no consolidated opposition to the expansion of the white settlements in South Africa. In terms of trying to understand this, I'm reading a segment by Jacob Daniel de Toit, or Totius, an Afrikaner poet, in his Potgieter's Trek. Darkest Africa, centuries old, a wild world. I see your gloomy picture, your endlessly vast savage coasts, surrounded by storms, seething, inhospitable. But wait, who comes spreading light? On your southern borders, light is moving, commanding the trekker with his rifle, his wagon, and book. In your interior, he seeks his freedom. But see the world become wilder. The fierce vermin worsen, stark, naked black hordes, following tyrants. How the handful of trekkers suffer, the freedom seekers, the creators of a people, just like another Israel. By enemies surrounded, lost in the veld, but for another Canaan elected, led forward by God's plan. Here on the Transvaal's high altar, we lifted up our hearts to Almighty God, our Father. You know how God saved us. Think of Laing's Neck in Gogo and Majuba's high cliffs. Woe to us if we forget God, as Israel did in Sinai. Of course, when they're referring to the idea of bringing the rifle and bringing the book he's obviously referring to, Totius, is the Bible, the good book. In terms of understanding this, I almost see this as, well, of course, it's analogous to the other white dominions. So we're talking about Canada and Australia. Of course, the issue of Canada was replicated in many senses, and the fact that, as with the Dutch in South Africa, the British administration conquered Canada, which was then dominated by France. Hence, to this day, the friction between the Quebecois and the Anglicized Canadians. Such a dynamic also exists here. But in the case of South Africa, the feeling of persecution and this desire to establish a free nation for the Afrikaners caused the Boers to abandon the relative safety of the Cape Colony and to move out into paths unknown to found a nation. Such an impetus existed within the original sort of desire for American independence, this idea to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains and move westwards, the conquest of the American West, so to speak. And indeed, there are other references you can draw to the program of Andrew Jackson that would permit no Native Americans to exist on the east side of the Mississippi River, moving them into the native reservations, which you could say are somewhat analogous of the homelands or the Bantustans, albeit in America's case, the solution was final, as opposed to the situation in South Africa, where it rebounded completely. And of course, deliberate reference to Israel, the idea that we do not forget God as Israel did in the Sinai, the idea that the Afrikaner movement towards establishing the nation, the Afrikanerdom, is in a sense sacred. It is bound up with the revolutionary, you can say missionary zeal of the Calvinist faith of the Dutch. So moving on from this, of course, as the Great Trekkers are going beyond their own iteration of the Appalachian Mountains, the British are chasing up with them. I'm not going to summarize a large section of 19th century Dutch history or Boer history here, because I think will be redundant. But when we finally reach the Boer Wars, first the Boer War around 1879, and then the Second Boer War in 1899, with the internment of tens of thousands of Boers in concentration camps, a large section of the population, these ideas of freedom and survival, you can say, become a core underpinning of the Boer identity. Indeed, as has been explained by Hexham, the idea of a distinct Afrikaner identity as a consolidated entity didn't really exist until the 1870s. When I'm talking about the Great Trekkers, of course, they didn't form one Afrikaner nation. They formed a series of colonies which would consolidate into the Orange Free State and Transvaal, which would identify itself as the South African Republic. So we're not talking about consolidated identities here, but a series of people stretched over different political authorities and vicinities, but all in some way identifying with this similar culture. And really, this is a part of apartheid, which is the manifestation of this culture into a sense of ire, or a sense of wanting to aspire to ownness. And you can say that what Trottis is doing here is you can say that the claims of apartheid, the claim to want to establish one's homeland, is in a sense not just religious, it is in fact utopian. So how do we consider the Boer War? I think we consider the Boer War as an example of the absurdity of South Africa in terms of its original creation. It is the inversion of the independence war narrative that, say, for example, America has. And indeed, it doesn't have the sort of same, motifs surrounding, the foundation of Australia. Indeed, the creation of Canada as a united colony wasn't so acrimonious as the foundation of South Africa, hence why today Canada, despite its large French-speaking population, is still technically under the British monarchy, while South Africa, of course, eschewed all claims to monarchy in 1961. So this is an article by André Wessels, The Anglo-Boer War and Its Traumatic Consequences. It's just one page. To most Afrikaners north of the Orange River, the only way that the injustice of the Peace of Vereeniging, again, do forgive my pronunciation, it's far from perfect, could be reversed, was by regaining the independence of the Boer republics, and much later the establishment of the Republic of South Africa. The Afrikaners who suffered most during the war were indeed those who lived in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and more specifically the inhabitants of the farms and towns, whose houses had been partially or entirely destroyed by British forces. However, the Boer War left almost all the race groups discontented in the country that from 1910 onwards was known as South Africa. Afrikanerdom was divided, the Bittereinders versus the hand-uppers and especially the joiners, while the Bittereinders in particular were embittered and humiliated. Coloureds, and especially black people, were frustrated because the end of the war did not yield the expected political and other privileges. Although the British authorities had created the impression during the war that they would give equal political and social rights to black people in exchange for their support against the Boers, some of them did not really intend to do so, while others, as had already been pointed out, were prepared in the interest of reconciliation with the Afrikaners to sacrifice the blacks' right to vote. Thus, black people were more suspicious of whites than ever and would soon seek political salvation in organizations such as the South African Native National Congress, which was established in 1912, later the ANC. As time passed, the black resistance movement, primarily working against white domination, would come to conflict with the conservative white resistance movement, initially fighting against British domination, and an important leitmotif in the political history of the 20th century South Africa would thus emerge, namely that of black nationalism versus Afrikaner nationalism, sometimes also manifesting itself in the binary opposition of black expectations versus white fears. Many Afrikaner leaders intended to consolidate Afrikaner power and thereby desired to heal the rift in Afrikaner ranks. Not everyone was prepared to cooperate with English-speaking South Africans, while cooperation was made with other race groups. That was not even on the cards. There were indeed attempts to uplift the Afrikaner in a material sense, but otherwise there were no coordinated initiatives to come into terms with the trauma caused by the War of 1899 and 1902. In due course, this contributed towards the development of an aggressive Afrikaner nationalism, with separate development, apartheid, as one of its most important manifestations. So, three major groups, and this also isn't to associate the idea of blacks as a homogenous group. Indeed, if we're looking at the composition of the ANC in South Africa today, it should be noted that the tribe affiliation of the president has a marked influence on the politics of South Africa. The most obvious example being Jacob Zuma, who was a Zulu, and the Zulus, of course, are a minority within Black South Africa. Then we have the Afrikaners, and as mentioned, the Afrikaners are they themselves divided, while the British did not necessarily derive the political and economic mastery that they had hoped by being able to win the war. And in a sense, they didn't really win the war. The British suffered massive casualties, and you can say that the attempt to create South Africa was you can almost say it was a commiseration. It was an attempt to bolster a sub-empire within the whole grander conception of the British Empire. First of all, it was a project by Cecil Rhodes, but of course he dies in 1902. And then the Rhodes project was taken over by Lord Milner, who was one of the figures most responsible at consolidating the identity and ultimately the political act of union of South Africa. And indeed, these were a bunch of unionists within the British Empire who were also, in my view, partly responsible for the creation of, you can almost say, the motivation behind getting involved in the First World War from Britain's point of view, for the sake of maintaining, or rather preventing, Irish Home Rule. Indeed, in terms of understanding, you can say this fundamental contradiction that lies at the heart of creating South Africa. Just look at the first three presidents, or rather prime ministers, or rather you can say the only notable three prime ministers before the apartheid era in 1948. The first was Louis Botha, who was, as with others, Smuts and General Herzog. All of them fought on the sides of the Boers in the Boer War, and yet they would become the three prime ministers of the pre-apartheid era. Louis Botha, despite starting off as a member essentially fighting off the Boers, and indeed he was the one, General Botha, responsible for capturing Winston Churchill, he would become an avowed sort of missionary of dominion status, if that makes sense. Jan Smuts, of course, would lead the South African participation in the First World War and the Second World War. And General Herzog, again, represents, you can say, this conflicted identity, more so than perhaps any other figure. I'd even include many of the apartheid figures in this, because Herzog was prime minister for a long time, from 1924 up until 1939. And when Great Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, it caused a huge amount of, you can say, controversy as to whether any of the Commonwealth nations, not just South Africa, would join up and declare war on Germany as reflecting the wishes of Britain. And this, you can say, was really a test of whether these nations were sovereign or they were vassal states. In the case of, say, somewhere like Ireland, the administration of Eamon de Valera believed that Irish independence and sovereignty would be demonstrated by their remaining neutral throughout the conflict, and of course they do. And of course, General Herzog wished to retain South African neutrality. This resulted in a crisis in his political party. He wanted to hold an election. The Governor General prevented him from holding an election, all but guaranteeing that General Herzog would be deposed and that South Africa would duly declare war on Germany 2 days later after the British declaration. In other words, there was a political crisis in South Africa, followed by a coup. And you can say that this forced participation in the Second World War, which brought Jan Smuts back into power after a long hiatus for a few decades, was essentially responsible, you can say, for bringing up a huge amount of the antipathy directed against the British, and indeed, you can say, a large section of antagonism towards internationalism. If Smuts was accused of anything, it really was this idea to position South Africa as a international leader, even in terms of drafting the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But I promised I would talk about this idea of a tale of two apartheids, one focusing on the religious conception of apartheid, the origins of this, you can say, in Dutch Calvinism, and the reality of apartheid, as we see with the master builder, Verwoerd. And again, I'm reading from Irving Hexham's, in this case on Calvinism and apartheid. Over and over, the same theme recurs. It was a form of 16th century Calvinism, isolated from the Enlightenment, which engulfed European thought in the 18th century, developed the Afrikaner people into the nation they are today. By its very repetition, it gains an authority of its own. By labeling it 16th century, critics implicitly condemn Afrikaner nationalism as outdated bigotry. But Afrikaner nationalists happily accept this description of their religion and culture, which supports their claims about the origins of the Afrikaner people. Naturally, they reject the charge of bigotry. They argue that their religion, if true, can never be outdated, although it may as well be unfashionable. Thus, the national polemicist Piet Meyer wrote in his book De Afrikaner, published in 1940, that the Afrikaner people are in truth the only people who have been born and have developed out of a Calvinist way of life. To elaborate on this, I'm reading from Saul Dubow's Apartheid. Now this, you can say, if there's going to be one major text for this presentation, it is this book. An important impetus for early formulations of the apartheid idea came from the missionary wing of the Dutch Reformed Church, which was directly in contact with black adherents. While pietists in the Dutch Reformed Church focused on the individual's relationship with God and tended to be conciliatory on matters of race relations, from the late 1920s, missionary leaders in the Orange Free State stressed the need to develop a more communal approach, specifically linking evangelical work to education and politics. For historians like Giliomee, who is going to feature prominently in the end of this presentation, the core of the apartheid idea emerged out of the efforts of those missionaries to reinforce Afrikaner ethnic identity by protecting its authentic cultural and spiritual aya, the quality of ownness. By contrast, the policy of gelijkstelling, equalization, or levelling, supposedly endorsed by English-speaking missionaries and liberals, was decried as a cause of race degeneration or bastardization. The Afrikaner folk, it was averted, had an ingrained aversion towards racial mixture or equality. It was God's will that their distinctive identity be protected. It was therefore possible to concede that humans were equal in the eyes of God without accepting equality in this world. In 1935, a meeting of the Federal Council of the Provincial Dutch Reformed Churches adopted a common missionary policy, which proved decisive in crystallizing views on the colour question. Whereas church pronouncements on segregation were equivocal in the mid-1920s, firm pronouncements were now made in respect of Afrikaners' traditional antipathy towards race mixing. The right of every nation to be itself was affirmed. Perceptions of economic and social vulnerability made the need for policy solutions more urgent. Rather than on the basis of scripture, existing segregationist theory and practice was considered no longer adequate to the task. The logic of Afrikaner nationalism strained towards the more sympathetic concept of apartheid, a term introduced into the Dutch Reformed discussions by J.G. Strijdom in 1938. This year also saw the triumphal reenactment of the centenary of the Great Trek, which culminated in a national festival on a hillside overlooking Pretoria, witnessed by upwards of 100,000 people. An imposing bunker-like monument, just give me a second, to Afrikaner history with Art Deco forms, bearing a strong resemblance to Wilhelmine architecture, was commissioned on the site. When the Voortrekker monument was inaugurated in December 1949, its architect, Budrich, explained its symbolism in terms of a great civilizing deed of the Voortrekkers and the settling and securing of white civilization in the interior of South Africa. Romanticized readings of Afrikaner historical experience rendered in marble friezes and stone carving of heroes in traditional dress use the past to narrate the future. The historic trek was given new meaning and force by the metaphor of a second trek, a movement designed to establish Afrikanerdom in the citadels of the modern cities. By now, roughly half the Afrikaner population were living in cities and towns, yet they continue to form only a small proportion of the professional classes and had barely begun to penetrate into the upper echelons of financial and business sectors. They were a distinct minority of civil servants. Afrikaners were heavily represented in the working classes, and it was this constituency that apartheid was directed to in particular. The iconography of the Voortrekker monument reflected a new sacralized version of history, which cast Afrikaners themselves as God's chosen people. In the words of sociologist Dunbar Moody, the increasingly pervasive ideology of Christian nationalism became a civic religion, with this distinctive theology of apartheid based on exegetical readings of scripture began to emerge. An important source of Dutch thinking was derived from the conservative Dutch theologian and politician Kuyper, whose writings introduced a powerful tradition of neo-Calvinist thought into the Dutch Reformed Church as a whole. Key tenets of Kuyperian theology included the notion that society was an organic whole, albeit one that was divided into separate spheres. In the case of society, the principle of sovereignty in every sphere should apply, ensuring separation between state, church, and social institutions. The principle of diversity, or pluriformity, entailed that each ethnic or radical group should maintain their own separate national or spiritual identity. Kuyperian neo-Calvinism was a metaphysical philosophy with broad applications. It concerned nationalist as well as apartheid thinking, which, though increasingly closely related, were not quite the same. On the occasion of the Broederbond sanctioned 1944 Volkscongress on Afrikaner racial policy, attended by representatives of some 200 churches and other cultural organizations, the leading nationalist poet, Toitius, who I mentioned earlier, unveiled a Kuyperian-inspired biblical justification of apartheid. And this, moving on from the same theme, which I read out earlier, he emphasized God's role as Hamadbil, or the great divider, that which God wished to remain separate in nature, our society, which would never be conjoined. For example, the lesson of the Tower of Babel was said to be that God caused those who wished to build an undifferentiated humanity to speak mutually incomprehensible languages. It surely followed that equality or intermixture between different groups was intolerable. Moving on from this, and really as a means of expanding upon this notion of Kuyperian ideology or theology, I'm reading an article by the same author, Afrikaner Nationalism, and you can find all the citations for the sources used here in the description. Kuyper assumed the leadership of the Dutch neo-Calvinist movement after the death of its founding figure, Groen van Prinsterer, in 1876. A fierce opponent of the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, he sought to oppose the corrosive individualism and uniform internationalism which he associated with liberal, secular, humanist ideals. Kuyper's key slogan was sovereignty in own sphere, which was the means by which he distinguished between different levels of existence. Each of these spheres was subject to God's overarching sovereign authority, but they enjoyed a certain autonomy within themselves. Thus, he was able to affirm the ultimate power of God in all aspects of life, while at the same time maintaining the need for a separation between church and state. This position made powerful sense given the Dutch neo-Calvinist desire to guarantee their independence as a political, social, and religious minority. Indeed, Kuyperian ideas contributed to the emergence in Holland of the idea of pillarization, the vertical division of Dutch society into discrete religious and secular blocks, each with their own self-contained organizations and social groupings. The Free University of Amsterdam, which Kuyper had helped to found, attracted many Afrikaner students and served as an important forum for the dissemination of his ideas. It was through Kuyper's writings that the principles of diversity, the idea of national destiny, and the concept of nation as an organism were absorbed and adapted for use in the South African context. Kuyper's vision of an all-embracing, Christian, national, Calvinist community in Holland provided a practical model for the ordering of the social as well as the religious aspects of society. His antipathy towards modernism and secular humanism struck an obvious chord amongst Afrikaner extremists who equated liberalism with British imperialism. And his romantic understanding of Calvinist history, which was confirmed by positive ideological support for the Boer cause during the Second Boer War. By the way, he was Dutch Prime Minister during this point, and it wasn't just the Dutch who were sympathetic. Kaiser Wilhelm was also sympathetic, which helped cause a major political rift between the British and the Germans. Helped Afrikaner ideologists to articulate a heroic mythology in which they portrayed themselves as God's chosen people. Kuyperian neo-Calvinism was present in its purest form in the Transvaal, though it's questionable to what extent it was genuinely taken up by organizations like the DLC as a whole, or rather the Dutch Reformed Church abbreviation. Similarly, the problem as to whether Kuyper's ideas were correctly interpreted by Afrikaner Calvinists remains a matter for debate. However, he undoubtedly served as a dynamic and powerful symbol of Calvinist authority in general, and a useful repository of evocative slogans. Kuyper's views are themselves contradictory and can be used to sustain opposing viewpoints. I won't necessarily say they're contradictory. Indeed, if many people hear my own views on subjects such as Catholicism and monarchy, a lot of people have been at pains to point out that I'm a hypocrite in many senses. I'm not. I just have very nuanced opinions, which, if taken slightly out of context, may appear as openly contradictory. In the case of Kuyperianism, I mean, other articles I've read talk about his, say, for example, his commitment to democracy, yet he is also opposed to this idea of leveling, this idea of homogenization. Indeed, if there is one force in the modern day which is associated with homogeneity, it is democracy. So he tries to defend democracy within this very particularist conception of it, which is divorced from the idea of blanket, you can say, administration, or indeed this idea of popular sovereignty. Again, he is opposed to the Enlightenment. He is opposed to the French Revolution. He associates all of these ideas as antithetical, you can say, to a authentic version of conservatism. So this idea of separation, of being essentially able to represent one's ownness, it may seem contradictory, as indeed you can say it's very difficult to maintain a perennialist, you can say sympathetic approach, but I don't believe they're fundamentally contradictory. I do believe apartheid is fundamentally dualistic and contradictory, but I don't necessarily think that is indicative of Kuyper's own arguments, even though it requires a large amount of context and nuance to understand. As Bloomberg points out, Kuyper's teaching were in intricate balances of paradoxes whose legacy can be seen in both authoritarian and libertarian, racialist and anti-racialist, elitist and democratic movements. For example, in his 1898 Stone's lecture, Kuyper advocated for the commingling of blood as the physical basis of all higher development, but in the South African crisis, he refers to the Hottentots and the Bantus as an inferior race and commends the Boers for protecting themselves from the danger of mixed liaisons. Kuyper's apparent enthusiasm towards racial intermixture, at least in the context of the Dutch East Indies, has understandably required delicate interpretation by Afrikaner nationalist adherents. And indeed, it's important to point out when we're talking about race mixture, of course, the population of the East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia, were not the same population in South Africa. Working in parallel with the Kuyperian inheritance, but not always entirely in sympathy with it, a distinctive Germanic set of influences should be mentioned, somewhat enigmatically referred to as Dunbar Moody as Neo-Fichtian. Fichtian. I'm not sure whether at one point I'm going to be discussing the historical works of Fichte, but nevertheless, he looms very large in terms of the sort of early construction of, say, German nationalism, with various precedents also going back to Schlegel, this idea of folkish or volksnationalist refers to a romantic tradition of authoritarian nationalism, which draws to various other figures going back even as far as Herder. It is marked by a strongly idealized new notion of the nation as folk, as a collective organism with its own distinctive genius or soul. Such ideas were brought to South Africa from the 1930s onwards by the likes of Neo Dieterichs, Piet Meyer, and Geoff Cronje, where they were skillfully adopted for local consumption of ideas. During the war years in particular, they did much to invest Afrikaner nationalism with a distinctly national socialist tinge, and that in a very, very broad sense, rather in terms of trying to look at this as national socialism as one sort of ideological monolith. National socialism has many facets, and you can almost say contradictory elements. Say, for example, we're going to take the positions of Goering, and we're going to compare him with the views of Strasser, for example. Kuyperian and German Volksnationalist views share a common romantic inheritance in their cultural idealism and hostility to rationalist thought. By rationalist thought is not reason, but the ideas emanating out of the Enlightenment. Both lay stress on the organic link between culture and nationhood, the idea that the creativity of the individual is best expressed through collectivity of the group, and the belief that nations are subject to divine historical destiny. In general terms, therefore, they tend to complement each other and are not readily separable in the Christian nationalist context. The oft-repeated description of society as organism is a useful example of this convergence. Kuyper was one of the chief sources of this metaphor, counterposing the organic of which he approved to the mechanical, for which he expressed strong disdain, beginning with Herder, the romantic tradition of German thought, which fed ultimately into organizations such as Völkisch nationalism and National Socialism, embraced the organic vision, stressing unity and worth of the national and folkish characteristics. Afrikaner nationalist ideologues constantly employed the organic metaphor in this collective sense, suggesting that the folk was a pure, natural, and integrated entity whose whole was more than the sum of its parts. However, the German tendency to idealize the nation or the folk and to accord its primacy above all else sits uneasily with the neo-Calvinist insistence on the ultimate sovereignty of God. It was precisely this theoretical difference which led Kuyperians to accuse Nico Diederichs in 1935-6 of subordinating the authority of God by deifying the nation. And indeed, you can say this is ultimately the reductio ad absurdum of National Socialism, which sought to sublimate organizations such as the United Lutheran Churches to the idea of the supreme reality of Germany. And of course, this existed in many facets of fascism, such as Falangism in Spain, the Catholics. The metaphysical sense in which Afrikaner nationalist theoreticians preferred to conceive of the nation or folk effectively provided an ideological justification for, again, the use which Durov again uses the word white supremacy. I mentioned at the beginning my qualifications for that word, without requiring recourse to biological scientific racism. The notion that God had ordained diversity or pluriformity facilitated the claim that difference did not necessarily imply superiority or inferiority. Similarly, stress on the distinctiveness of different cultures meant that the burden of explaining human difference did not rest solely on race. This does not mean that culture and race were regarded as being unrelated. On the contrary, categories of race, language, culture were used as functionally interdependent variables, and the boundaries between them remained fluid. In practice, the essentialist view of culture, which lay at the heart of Christian nationalism, was no less powerful as a means of dividing people than as an approach based on racial determinism. I'll be back with you all just in 1 second. So having discussed the religious core in terms of being able to identify this, I mean, it's not just a religious core. All of this is commingling, as Durov identifies, with elements of Völkisch nationalism in Germany and the inheritance of Herder, Fichte, Schlegel, which he didn't identify, but I think is clearly in evidence. We're looking at some sort of grand intellectual trajectory and seeing a similar development. Indeed, although pre-apartheid, Herzog was responsible for implementing, you can say, forerunner legislation in 1935, 1936. Indeed, that would become the basis of the demarcation of the 13% territory, which is allocated to the homelands or Bantustans for blacks. It is clear that he was very much influenced by not just folkish nationalism, by National Socialism. And in hindsight, you can say that is one of the reasons why Herzog emphasized neutrality, which ultimately got him deposed in September of 1939. But now I'm going to be talking more explicitly about the apartheid conception vis-a-vis race. I'm returning to Durov's Apartheid book. Notable exceptions to this religious conception was proposed by sociologist J.F. Cronje, who jointly wrote in 1947 the book A Just Apartheid, which included Groenewald's scriptural justifications for apartheid. This indicated the wish to amalgamate Christian national and romantic nationalist traditions with a strong emphasis on contemporary social reality. Cronje's writings on apartheid are suffused by visceral fears of race mixing and contamination, prompted by the dangers of whites and blacks living adjacent to each other in degrading conditions of poverty. Again, there's a huge amount of class scholarship, Marxist scholarship, focusing on the origins of apartheid. Fundamentally, the idea that the Afrikaner, close proximity, the working class movement, the revolt essentially against the internationalist elites, all of these things are permeating here. And in order to rescue the Afrikaner working class out of this predicament, it not only involves a form of apartheid, but you can say it involves a aspect of class warfare as well. The moral purity of Afrikaner women who could easily produce bastard children, bastard of course not meaning it's illegitimate, but bastard being the result of miscegenation, should at all costs be protected. Anticipating later refinements in apartheid policy and thinking, Cronje distinguished between the threat to white supremacy posed by Indians who were characterized as aliens, coloureds who were culturally and physiologically deracinated, and Africans whose Bantu culture had to be preserved by preventing them from being detribalized. On account of the relative social proximity to whites, Indians and coloureds figured disproportionately in Cronje's fears. They represented a different kind of danger from the mass of ordinary Africans in the cleanse and order society that apartheid's theorists sought to construct. Indians represented a particular threat. They were relatively recent immigrants whose success as traders and businessmen presented direct competition to whites. Coloureds posed a different problem. They were visible evidence of past racial intermixture. It was not uncommon within international eugenic and racial thinking to focus fears on the socially and racially defined groups who posed the greatest threat to various conceived boundaries. This is why many eugenicist criminologists were far more concerned by the feeble-minded than the less mentally able idiots or imbeciles. It also helps to explain why the capacity of Jews to assimilate to the dominant order and achieve prominence as communists, as well as capitalists, pose such a threat to anti-Semites in South Africa, anti-Jews, just as in other parts of the world. Anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness, was a significant mobilizing force within the Afrikaner nationalist movement in the 1930s and 1940s most especially, and of course it wouldn't be helped when Jewish members of the Communist Party were seen as ultimately financing the terrorist acts of the ANC in the 1950s and at their peak under the sword of the nation in the 1960s. Just for reference, I prefer using the term anti-Jewish rather than anti-Semitic, simply because anti-Semitic as a qualifier is a misnomer, because Jews do not monopolize the position of Semites. Arabs, for example, are Semites, so just a little pet peeve of mine. Racial eugenicists were frequently more worried by perceived threats to racial purity and white racial prestige than they were concerned to assert racial differences as fact. The existence of innate racial difference was taken for granted. Racial hysteria was commensurately greater with more advanced representatives of subject groups, westernized urban Africans, for example, who came into contact and competition with vulnerable poor whites. This helps to explain why the detribalized African was so much more of a figure of hate and contempt than the Africans conforming to what was taken to be the tribal tradition. Now, this is interesting. This is probably the greatest point of departure between someone like Hendrik Verwoerd and Ian Smith. Ian Smith, going back to an idealized conception of Cecil Rhodes, believed that that form of Black African was the ideal to conform, the idea of the civilized African joining essentially white civilized society. Whereas in the case of South Africa, it represented an existential threat to the purity of the Aya, the purity of Afrikanerdom. So the nation building project within the conception of apartheid is explicitly white. And as I said, in the case of Ian Smith, it was explicitly a gradualist program. Cronje's obsessive preoccupation with blood purity, the horror of mixture and contagion, was given an even more overt eugenic spin by the geneticist Jerry Eloff, who essayed a Christian national theory of race biology. In 1942, Eloff proposed a view of the Boer folk as a distinct biological type. The Afrikaner race, he reasoned, was the fortuitous result of mixture between European, Nordic, and Alpine races. Its purity had to be protected like a sacred pledge against poisonous infiltration. Afrikaners' distinctive racial composition offered the key to understanding their divine national destiny. By Alpine conception, I think he's referring to the mixture not just of Dutch genes, but of Huguenot genes. Indeed, D.F. Malan, even the origin of the name is Huguenot. And of course, Huguenots were French Calvinists, hence Calvinism being integral to this idea of Afrikaner independent identity. As for Niels Alexander, your question in the chat, I'm going to be talking about that in a more sort of general counterfactual sense at the end. The eugenic writings of Cronje and Eloff, as well as sprinklings by anthropologists and psychologists, constitute a distinct subtradition of biological determinism in Afrikaner thinking. In itself, the ideological appeal of such procrastinations was limited. Biological-based evolutionist theory sat uneasily with literal readings of scripture. Moreover, they opened up troubling possibility that Afrikaner poverty might itself be eugenic in origin. Indeed, that was the claim of many socialists. This constrained the utility of eugenic ideas for mainstream Afrikaner nationalism. However, when linked more loosely to popular fears about racial intermixture and contamination, and when dignified by the putative historical desire to maintain racial boundaries, racial thinking carried strong emotional weight. It evoked generalized feelings of anxiety, disgust, and hatred. And again, you can say Dubow's a large, running theme throughout all of his articles and his books. Is this conception of relating back to trope, relating back to cliche, the idea that all of these ideas were deliberately and in some senses disingenuously exaggerated in order to achieve political outcomes, in this case apartheid. Race awareness was thus a palpable aspect of South African life. It was deeply entrenched in everyday life, in relations based on paternalism and in social custom. Crude vernacular racism, which vernacular racism I assume you mean on a sort of a regional systematic basis in terms of conceiving of what vernacular racism is, was endemic in political campaigning, in parliamentary debates, as well as in private discourse. A vernacular of racism, and try and understand the implications of what that means. Apartheid ideology, depending on race awareness, and did much to arouse racial consciousness, though it did not create such awareness. I'm just thinking in terms of that language. I'm sure Democrats would accuse Donald Trump of being employing crude vernacular racism. Nor did apartheid promote active race hatred or even condone it at an official level. The oppression of blacks by the state meant the acts of private or collective violence, such as lynching, were far less common in segregationist South Africa than they were in the American South. What made apartheid persuasive as an ideology was the manner in which it channeled race awareness into a defensible philosophy of difference operating at multiple levels. Conspicuous care was taken by leading apartheid thinkers, especially once they achieved power, to use circumlocutory language when it came to asserting racial inferiority and superiority. In the post-war world, crude racism was a diminishing political asset. Insistence on difference based on culture was in any case more flexible and durable, and in many respects more insidious. All the composite elements of apartheid thinking were beginning to coalesce by 1943, when the term started to be used by D.F. Malan in his political speeches. The idea or aspiration had been current in Afrikaner theological, intellectual, and policy-making circles for a decade more. The Bond vir Rassenstudie, an earlier think tank, adopted apartheid as early as 1936, and again, this was coinciding with a series of laws brought in by General Herzog, in order to distinguish the Afrikaner concept of total segregation from the less rigorous notion of segregation. Journals such as the Koers and Inspan provided ample space for the elaboration of key ideas. The Mission Council of the Dutch Reformed Church, in a memorandum presented to the government in 1942, stated its support for the principle of race apartheid on the grounds of self-preservation and Christian charity. For all this, apartheid thinking was not yet indispensable to nationalist concerns in the way that anti-imperialist, Republican, or poor white poverty already was. In terms of just understanding the concept of republicanism, there are several aspects in terms of identifying Republican. One, of course, is, you can say, an anti-aristocratic, more leveling notion inherent in African thought, which is Afrikaner thought, which is going back to this idea of it being a working class movement. Then you can also look at this in terms of a historical awareness, and indeed you can say a authenticity inherent in Afrikaner identity, which goes back to Paul Kruger in the Transvaal Republic, which identified itself as the South African Republic, and that being the true government form of Afrikanerdom, or the Boers. And then there is republicanism, which is associated as the opposition to the British Empire, to the Commonwealth. And so this idea of white South African republicanism isn't unique to South Africa, of course. Eamon de Valera pioneered it and achieved it some 20 years before South Africa would in 1961. Again, a explicitly anti-liberal, anti-British imperialist perspective on republicanism being a way essentially of ensuring sovereignty, and you can say a whole reconception of what foreign policy is in terms of looking at South Africa. But those are the more sophisticated arguments, indeed, as Dubow himself has alluded to. And contrast this with J.G. Studidom, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa from 1954 to 1958. He's sometimes seen as nothing more than a transition figure between the more noteworthy predecessor and successor, Malan and Verwoerd. But nevertheless, he identifies a rather, you can say, crude form of political thought, which represents a fundamental paradox within the concept of apartheid. J.G. Studidom, leader of the Transvaal Nationalists who succeeded Malan as Prime Minister, was one of those who disdained moralizing about the finer points of trusteeship and Christian duty. He was an outright believer in the notion of Baskap, literally bossship, but I'm sort of using the more innocuous or roughly translated notion of mastery as to contrast with the more, you can say, bastardized form of white supremacy. I don't mean that in the apartheid context. I don't mean that within the etymological context. I mean that in terms of how that word has been bastardized to almost be a point of ridicule, not point to a point of ridicule, without the intellectual trimmings. Speaking in Parliament shortly before 1948, Studidom mocked those who pretended they could understand what the nationalists meant by apartheid. Quite simply, it meant that he would not sit in a bus alongside a native. Apartheid was essentially a matter of domination. Either you are boss, the equal, or the inferior, or one of the three. If you are not boss, you must be man's equal. It is so clear and logical. If you say that you do not want to dominate the native, It simply means that you stand for the policy of equality. There was no ambiguity either when Stolidon pronounced in 1955 that our task in South Africa is to maintain the identity of the white man. In that task, we will die fighting. So there is a deep siege mentality. There is a survivalist notion. And indeed, if we expand on this idea of Baskap, this idea of mastery, it means that South Africa itself, or more broadly incorporating all white elements, including British elements of South Africa, becomes the province of the white race. It becomes a white hegemony, in which case the blacks must essentially assume a diminished position within that, despite representing the overall larger scale of the population. And you can say, in terms of the ultimate logic of sustaining the white project in South Africa, we talk about the massive security state, the army, the possession of nuclear weapons, the threats of the entrenchment of communism. All of these practical considerations, you can say, lead to a cruder form of conception of Baskap, as opposed to the more idealized Christian and romanticized notion of Eya, which is this idea of Afrikaner independence from this multifaceted, pluralistic conception of South Africa itself. You can say that Afrikanerdom is the antithesis to the rainbow nation, which is not really surprising when you consider the issues focused around Orania and even the notion of West Cape independence today, and why perhaps the Democratic Alliance would rather form a coalition with the ANC rather than support Cape independence, as just one example. So here we come to the fundamental turning point, 1948. As I've tried to sort of be at pains to say, there is a very broad trajectory, not just intellectual, but in terms of tangible historical examples and events which lead to the creation of an Afrikaner identity. The Boer War, of course, being the most obvious example, with notions of a cultural ethnogenesis arising throughout the course of the 19th century. Nevertheless, 1948 is often pointed at as some sort of great shock or turning point rather than the continuity. And I'll explain more, not just about the election, but about the fundamental position and political importance of the National Party in terms of being synonymous effectively with the regime of apartheid. And here I'm returning to Dubow. Apartheid was the election slogan which brought radical Afrikaner nationalism to power in South Africa in May of 1948. The stunning victory of the National Party was almost entirely unanticipated by journalists, politicians, and the public, prompting the question whether the election was lost by the government or won by the opposition. On the eve of the election of Prime Minister Jan Smuts' deputy, Geoff Hofmeyr, recorded privately that his party would maintain or even improve its position. Nationalist leader D.F. Mullen, who was almost as surprised by his victory as his old opponent Smuts, who suffered the additional humiliation of losing his own seat in Standerton. In the previous election of 1943, the governing United Party had emerged with double the number of seats of the Nationalists, and in 1948 it seemed to be able to comfortably defend its overall majority. How black South Africans viewed the impending change of government is not easy to establish. A mixture of fear and indifference would be a reasonable guess. In his memoir, Albert Luthuli, later president of the ANC, reflected that it was doubtful whether anybody realized how significant the election would be. For most of us Africans, bandied about on the field white the game was in progress and then kicked to one side when the game was won, the election seemed largely irrelevant. Walking to his Johannesburg lawyer's office on the day of the result in 1948, the young ANC leader, Oliver Tambo, was confronted by a youth who spat in his face. Tambo interpreted this hostility as a clear statement of a new racial order, noting to himself that it would help to clarify the nature of the enemy. The surprise of Mullen's victory was magnified by the widespread view that Smuts, who towered over South African politics, was unassailable. Though past his political peak was visibly aging, Smuts still bestrode the political stage. His leadership in the Second World War had proved valuable to the Allies, capping a remarkable career as a statesman that stretched back to the First World War, and before this to the romantic role commanding guerrilla forces in the Boer War. The crowning moment in Smuts' political career came in 1947, when he hosted the British royal family on their South African tour. This much publicised event was a mark of personal esteem within the Commonwealth. The man of war was also the apostle of international peace. Smuts was not only a signatory of the Charter of the new United Nations organization, but had participated in the League of Nations. He helped to draft the preamble to the United Nations Charter and was largely responsible for the inclusion of the phrase human rights. As much as he was revered, the old Boer war hero was also reviled. African nationalists charged Smuts with having sold out to capitalist imperialism by siding with Britain in 2 wars and for supporting the mining industry against white workers in 2 bloody strikes. Charismatic but remote and aloof, Smuts was out of touch with domestic politics. He had made a mistake in assuming that his own people would never turn against him. Hubris proved to be his undoing. There are obviously analogies that one can draw with Jan Smuts and Churchill, but of course, in the case of the 1945 election in the UK, the country rejected Churchill and went far to the left in electing Clement Attlee. Of course, in the case of D.F. Malan and the Nationalist Party, it went the other way. But fundamentally, as you can see, whilst Churchill was able to encapsulate a whole sort of personalized conception of bulldog nationalism, in the case of Jan Smuts, given the incredibly controversial way in which he was brought to power through the ouster of General Herzog, as I've mentioned, the South Africans were always unwilling partners within the war. You can say Jan Smuts' overrepresentation within the whole schema was able to, say, for example, reconcile, at least superficially, to the international world that South Africa was an enthusiastic partner in the war and not an unwilling member brought along as a result of a political and constitutional contrivance. Nevertheless, you can say the reality of that simmering resentment of having not been neutral in the war was a part, you can say, in terms of understanding the reality of the political constituency of Jan Smuts rather than simply construing Jan Smuts as simply another Churchill. Although Malan's parliamentary lead over Smuts was just 5 seats in 1948, a pact secured with the splinter Afrikaner party, led by N.C. Havenga, proved sufficient to form a government. In the Senate, their majority was just 1. The Nationalist hold on power was tenuous, and of course, the Dominion being a Westminster system had 2 houses. The Nationalist hold on power was tenuous, and many considered their victory to be merely a temporary aberration. It was only by virtue of an electoral system favourably biased towards white rural constituencies, where Afrikaner farmers predominated, that the Nationalist Alliance was in a position to form a government at all. South Africa's new Prime Minister, D.F. Malan, was a stalwart of Cape nationalist politics, a dogged rather than dynamic leader who steered a prudent path between the party's constitutional and authoritarian tendencies. Many nationalist leaders were known to have been Nazi sympathizers during the war. Those who had fought Hitler's armies in North Africa and the Mediterranean dubbed them the Malan-Nazis. Aged 74 at the extension of his premiership, Malan at first seemed fazed by his success. He had been a minister in several rural parishes of the DRC, the Dutch Reformed Church in the Cape, before giving up in 1915 to pursue a political career, initially as founding editor of the Cape's Afrikaans newspaper, Dubow. Malan's religious outlook was orthodox, his political views were conservative rather than revolutionary. He was relatively unaffected by the dogmatic neo-Calvinist abstractions that had taken root in the centres, such as Potchefstroom. He disapproved of the young, rigid ideological extremists based in the Transvaal and viewed their political leader, J.G. Strijdom, with great suspicion. By the way, Strijdom was known as the Lion of the North in terms of his capture of that political base, and he was a person that Malan explicitly did not want to succeed in. Malan saw the 1948 election as the providential outcome of a long and bitter political struggle to secure Afrikaner power and to redress the wrongs of British imperialism. Announcing victory, he is said to have proclaimed, "Today, South Africa belongs to us once more. For the first time since union, South Africa is our own. May God grant that it will always remain our own." Here Malan was echoing the National Party's psalm, which began with the chant, "Love for what is your own nation, your own citizenship, your own South Africa. Again, ownness, eya. Emphasis again on possession of oneself, apartheid as representing a form of sovereignty, of ascending Afrikanerdom essentially into its own nation, of capturing the nation, of South Africa becoming Afrikaner. These sentiments played on the emotional chords which had dominated Afrikaner nationalist political movements for a generation: unity of and pride in the folk, Christian nationalism and anti-imperialism and republicanism. Malan's victory was as much as anything a victory over his own Afrikaner nationalist constituency. It was only since the 1943 election that he had managed to establish himself as Afrikanerdom's unchallenged leader. A recent biography portrayed Malan as an aging, reticent politician who was never in full control of his cabinet and who was primarily concerned to consolidate Afrikanerdom's historic victory in a rapidly changing world that he scarcely understood. Steeped in the Cape's traditions of coexistence between English and the Afrikaner speakers, Malan was disinclined to force the divisive issue of republicanism. He understood that a substantial proportion of white South Africans, Afrikaners as well as English-speaking, continued to value the Commonwealth's connection and were suspicious of ultranationalism. So rather than basically seeing him as reticent, you can basically say that Malan, in contrast to his successor, and indeed even to Verwoerd, was very much a pragmatist in terms of understanding, you can say, the tentative nature of his political position and willing to let go on issues such as republicanism until events were forced with decolonization in the 1960s. Even though it should be noted that, I forget his name, but the penultimate Governor General of South Africa, who was appointed during the premiership of Malan, refused to acknowledge the Queen, acknowledge the symbols of his office. And for all intents and purposes, from the 1950s, South Africa was a de facto republic, even if not a committed republic. Not something as pronounced to say, for example, Hermann de Valera going out to officially abolish all the residual constitutional elements associated with the Irish Dominion status, Irish monarchy, and becoming the Irish Republic in 1930s. So in many cases, you can say that D.F. Malan is probably a more conservative figure when contrasted with someone like Hermann de Valera. Indeed, Malan wasn't a terrorist, he was a Calvinist minister. Malan's victory exposed the lethargy of the governing United Party and showed that the wartime achievements of Smuts were less substantial than they seemed. Smuts' government could claim some credit for having engineered a successful war economy. The most vigorous economic growth was secondary industry, where the gross value of output at constant prices in 1849 was twice what it had been in 1939. Manufacturing now exceeded agriculture, as well as mining as a percentage of GDP. But economic expansion also highlighted long-term imbalances and exacerbated social tensions that the government seemed poorly equipped and even reluctant to tackle. Rapid economic growth had done much to erode white poverty, an issue of central importance to the nationalists, but Smuts' government was ill-positioned to profit from this. Rather than assuaging opposition voters, the relatively benign economic political situation in the post-war encouraged festering grievances. There was widespread resentment over the unavailability of basic commodities, adequate housing, and delays in finding employment for ex-servicemen. Price inflation stretched the household budgets of many ordinary voters. Consumers complained of the lack of availability of white bread and temporary shortages of meat. Amongst whites, it was Afrikaners who were most acutely affected by urban poverty, a long festering problem that the 1932 Carnegie Commission into poor whiteism had brought to widespread public notice. Afrikaners constituted around 29% of the urban population in 1910 and 50% in 1936. Though they were still heavily outnumbered by English-speaking people in cities like Cape Town and Johannesburg, feeling of inferiority and insecurity pervaded the new Afrikaner arrivals in the cities. A conference organized by the DRC in 1947 to consider the problems of urban life concluded that as many as 3/4 of the Afrikaners in the cities were working class. A high proportion of this group were poorly educated and insecure. Crucial to the National Party were its electoral breakthroughs in the urban areas of the Witwatersrand. By 1948, there were for the first time many or more Afrikaners resident in urban than rural areas. Ordinary working class Afrikaners felt doubly vulnerable. On the one hand, they suffered from a deep sense of inferiority as regards the English speakers, one that I've gone at pains to mention stems all the way from the beginning of the 19th century. On the other, they felt deeply alarmed by the rapidly growing urban African population. Between 1936 and 51, the proportion of Africans living in cities grew from 17.3% to 27%, while in Johannesburg, the African population grew by nearly 60%. Between 1936 and 46, outnumbering white residents for the first time. Perhaps 100,000 people lived in informal settlements on the city's periphery, with few amenities or services. In East London in 1950, of 66,000 African residents, 85% were recent migrants from the countryside. A striking feature of this pattern of urbanization was the rising number of African women living in towns and cities. Many of the African migrants succeeded in eluding capture by the state, in Philip Bonner's striking phrase. Unclear lines of responsibility meant the jurisdiction of municipalities overlapped, uncertainty with the police, the Central Housing Board, and the Departments of Justice and Social Welfare. Administrative chaos heightened worries that blacks were living beyond official control. And of course, even though this represents a form of internal migration, I think we can see the same system happening perhaps on an even larger scale across the West today. The preeminence of the remodeled National Party was challenged by a number of right-wing parliamentary organizations, and someone in the chat has already foreshadowed this. The Osserbrandwag, in particular, which was overtly sympathetic to the Nazis, rejecting parliamentary politics in favor of a Republican folk state. In Parliament, the Nationalists were sniped at by the Nazis supporting New Order, which briefly existed until 1943. Holding the ring, or attempting to do so, was the Afrikaner Brotherhood, a self-selected secretive body composed of the Afrikaner elite. It had started as a cultural organization in 1918, but soon expanded its impetus to take a lead in political and social matters. By the mid-1940s, the Broederbond, now numbering about 2,800 people, presided over a dense network of overlapping civic and cultural affiliations centered on the economically powerful northern regions of the country. The Broederbond proved highly influential in developing strategies and propaganda to support the achievement of a Christian national republic under Afrikaner rule. In 1930, the Broederbond issued a statement proclaiming the need for Afrikaner domination under its own leadership. Its practical initiatives focused on the need for the folk to uplift itself. Well-executed plans for social mobilization entail sponsorship of business and insurance organizations, the formation of Africans' trade unions, and support for institutions advocating the principle of self-help. With extensive interest in culture, welfare, education, news, sports, politics, the Broederbond created a large number of front organizations to secure its objectives. Elsewhere, its members were deputy to influence or establish control of organizations on societies which they had broad representation. It's interesting to consider that an idea by Cecil Rhodes, who was Prime Minister of the Cape shortly before the Boer War, during which he was essentially disgraced, had conceived of various organizations, including the scholarship, as a means essentially of creating an imperial elite, which will be based indeed trying to subvert the idea of, say, for example, the Freemasons. If we look at the Brotherhood, the Broederbond, I think it's very clear to see that the apartheid advocates, you can say the natural elites within Afrikanerdom, were able to actually achieve something like this and forming a counter secret society, a counter series of Freemasons, albeit their civic religion in complete contrast to something like Freemasonry, which sees essentially itself as universalist and emphasizing the unity of mankind. In the case of the Broederbond, the civic religion, of course, was apartheid. It was separateness, albeit even at this time in the 1940s, it had not become a clear matter of policy, but evoking all of these intellectual traditions, which I brought back to early Calvinism. One of the Broederbond's signal successes was to broker an accord in 1942 between the Osserbrandwag and the National Party in the form of a draft constitution. This document envisaged a future South Africa as a Christian, national, Afrikaner-dominated, sovereign folk state existing outside of the British Empire.
Notably, the Statement of Shared Principle made no mention of apartheid, though a commitment to strict racial segregation, subject to continued availability of African labour, was tacked on to the end. By 1944, republicanism was no longer such a divisive factor within Afrikanerdom. With Germany's defeat, fascism was much less alluring. The Osservanderwerk began to disintegrate as a mass organisation and therefore diminish as a rival to the National Party. The relaxation of an internecine strife allowed the Broederbond to turn its attention more fully to the colour question. The shift in focus was reflected more broadly in the 1948 election campaign. The nationalists deliberately chose to play down their core Republican ambitions, reassured war veterans that they would be cared for, and desisted from attacks on Jews and English speakers. Milan's decision to downplay threats against the English as an official language helped make the National Party more electable. So indeed, even though 1948 is considered this sort of major shift to the right, which in some ways it was, it's also important to understand that in terms of the fundamental position of conceiving of apartheid and the National Party, it was trying to stymie you can say, an ambiguous and half-hearted reform effort that had begun under Jan Smuts, but was more typified under Hofmeyr, his deputy prime minister, the idea of the integrated war economy, bringing blacks into urban centres, offering social programs from reform to blacks, a pathway eventually to universal human rights and participation in government. You can say almost this was the Rhodesia situation, apartheid versus the Rhodesia situation. It's no surprise that Ian Smith views 1948 as the dark turning point whereby Rhodesia and South Africa effectively diverged when it came to core ideology. But in the case of D.F. Malan and the Nationalist Party, it really does say, for example, represent a consolidation of things that had already been going on since, well, really the founding of South Africa, and the consolidation of Afrikaner dominance, but not Afrikaner exclusivity, again, emphasizing the contradictions within apartheid. They're de-emphasizing the fundamental core tenets of their civic religion, namely republicanism, one element. They're coming to terms with the fact that, yes, they may have disagreed with the participation in the Second World War, but they will still honor the commitment of South African natives and citizen subjects who were involved in that conflict. Yes, we have historical grievances with the English, most notably exhibiting themselves during the Second Boer War, but as with the careers of Louis Botha and Jan Smuts himself, we can look at this and tend to reconcile a broader national constituency among all whites in terms of the supporting of the apartheid ideology. So, as I said, within the grand context, Jan Smuts, of course, was more of a centrist. I mean, even compared to General Herzog, who died during the course of the war, but came out as, you can say, even to the right of Malan, and he'd been prime minister before Jan Smuts. For example, there wasn't an attempt to explicitly reject the whole Westminster system of government. There was no repudiation of democracy among whites themselves. Indeed, there were revisions you also see under Botha, who in many senses also represented a form of apartheid white nationalist centrism in the 1970s and 1980s. So just to finish off on the segment about the election, the National Party's official election campaign, again reading from Dubow, offered the country a choice between integration and national suicide on the one hand, and apartheid and the protection of the pure white race on the other. Race formed part of the sediments of daily life and was subconsciously present in the fears and anxieties of whites, but neither race nor apartheid was the only issue confronting voters in 1948. According to Giliomee, apartheid policy was a relatively minor aspect of the nationalist electoral campaign. Afrikaans newspaper editorials may have highlighted the issue of race, but this concern was not reflected in newspaper letter columns. At least as important was the perception of Afrikaners had been discriminated against by the Smuts administration. Bread and butter issues such as government incompetence, anti-communism, and a sense that the world was turning against white South Africa were prominent themes as well. The use of apartheid in Malan's 1948 campaign certainly proved effective as a means to discomfort the government and unite the opposition. To the extent apartheid was more a tactical ploy than a coherent policy, that the nationalists were unable to define precisely what they meant by apartheid, when challenged to do so, it did not detract from the utility of the word. In some ways, it made the idea even more effective by allowing different constituencies to overlook policy contradictions and unite around a vague cure-all. Most significant as far as the government supporters are concerned was the fact that apartheid connotated Afrikaner's strength and resolve. So even having achieved political power, and indeed in terms of the emphasis of the narrowness of the victory, the National Party will be involved in a whole series of constitutional contrivances throughout the next 50 years. But nevertheless, it wasn't an aberration, the 1948 election victory. The National Party were able to win every election up until 1994. But it wasn't just a cynical ploy. If it was a cynical ploy, the whole basis of the stream wouldn't exist. There is a vague concept, and now we're talking about the concept of apartheid and achieving a form of praxis, achieving a form of application in terms of looking at apartheid, again, a career of a concept, going back to Paul Gottfried. So how can we implement the policy of apartheid? Again, a couple more segments from Dubow. Speaking in the Senate in 1948, Verwoerd denied that apartheid was a policy of total segregation, or that it had been fraudulently sold to the electorate. Apartheid was an ideal, but the government accepted that it was not practicable. In an open letter to an American churchman in 1954, Dr. Mallon reprised the views he had articulated since 1948. Apartheid, he explained, was in essence the traditional racial policy practiced since the beginnings of European settlement over 300 years. So in the sense, again, of emphasizing national Catholicism, national Calvinism, national Calvinism, and you can say ideologies rooted back to 300 years. If you're looking at the ideas of Herder, you're looking at the ideas of Fichte, all of these emphasis on organism, organic nature, apartheid cannot be seen as a contrivance. It cannot be seen as a mechanistic formula. It has to represent something which is in continued existence. In a metaphysical context, as Dubow has already alluded to, this relates to the Christian nationalist notion of a. But nevertheless, how do you take that and how do you actually see the policy of apartheid being implemented? And again, that is when I've gone over Verwoerd, I really want to get at, you can say, the fundamental contradictions in this, in terms of Milan conceiving of this and indeed legitimating the idea of apartheid as this broader concept, which has always existed in South Africa, as opposed to representing this radical turn in 1948. Back to Dubow. It expressed the deep-rooted colour consciousness of the white South Africans. This consciousness was itself the physical manifestation of the contrast between two irreconcilable ways of life, between barbarism and civilization, between heathenism and Christianity. It was conditioned by the overwhelming demographic imbalance between blacks and whites. Milan also insisted that apartheid was a positive and non-repressive policy based on the Afrikaner's divine calling and his privilege to convert the heathen to Christianity without obliterating his national identity. In theory, apartheid could only be achieved by dividing the country into two states, with whites in one and blacks in the other. But Milan acknowledged that full implementation of the policy would make for very many years. It was an experiment which was only in its initial stages. This, then, was the way in which apartheid was publicly presented by the first nationalist parliament as more rigorous, methodical, and fair application of the age-old principles of racial segregation, as the most effective manner of guaranteeing the security of white Christian civilization, and as an ideal to be worked towards the benefits occurring to blacks as well as whites. The message to ordinary white voters was clear. White supremacy was established, racial boundaries would be maintained at all costs. Again, that's Dubow's opinion, but I want to add a bit of nuance to this in terms of contrasting the idea of Afrikaner separatism and Baskap, the idea of white domination over the Bantustans, and the fundamental, what is it? Equal, the mantra of Jim Crow in America, separate but equal. that notion wasn't really that much in evidence when it came to South Africa, not just in terms of the actual sort of results, but in terms of the implementation of hard policy. Someone in the chat is saying the inception of the Bantustans. Well, remember that as with the notion that apartheid as a concept had really been in existence and represented an organic form of ideology for Afrikaners, the Bantustans also, by that very nature, had always been in existence, and that the Afrikaners, in recognizing those tribal boundaries, were recognizing a on-the-ground reality, as opposed to trying to create a rainbow nation, the Mandela nation, which would be seen as not just antithetical to these ideas, but incompatible to the whole sort of notion of being South African. But as I pointed out, going back to the Boer War, the whole notion of being South African has, even today, I would argue, it's always been in flux. And the South African Rainbow Nation is as much as an experiment as indeed the Rainbow Nation is with apartheid. So apartheid, Rainbow Nation, just to emphasize that in case I wasn't very clear on that. So we've gone from the elucidation of policy. Now we talk about the laws actually implementing apartheid. The government moved quickly to secure its control over the civil service, which was nominally non-political, in line with British traditions. When Everett Poole was passed over as Army Chief of Staff in 1948, and the head of the railways was replaced by an Afrikaner a year later, it became clear that political affiliations would henceforth determine the pattern of senior positions in the government administration. In departments like the police, justice, education, and native affairs, where English speakers had long been strongly represented at senior levels, loyal nationalists were rapidly promoted. Patronage was a key means of retaining and rewarding reliable National Party functionaries in the fast-growing apartheid bureaucracy. Competence was a lesser consideration. By 1959, the process of Afrikanerization meant that of more than 40 government departments and sub-departments, only 6 were headed by English speakers. So fundamentally, redressing the Afrikaner conception of persecution and inferiority, not just a working class revolt, but this is a full sort of circulation of the elites within the concept of white-dominated South Africa. The Afrikaners are taking hold. They are taking things which in the Westminster system are considered sacrosanct, like the depoliticized civil service, and they are subordinating it essentially to the whims of the party. Indeed, I'm very cynical. There is no such thing as an apolitical managerial state. But the conscious policy of Malan and his successors is to subordinate the civil service to the express ideological purposes of the party. And indeed, as we'll later see with the Native Affairs Department, managerialism and bureaucracy becomes a core component of the basis of National Party rule during the apartheid era. The Afrikaner capture of the state was consolidated through public corporations like the railways, the electricity supply, commission, and national steel industry. The civilized labor policy, which had been used to secure jobs for unemployed whites on the railways in the 1920s and 30s, was now extended to include the civil service more generally. O'Mara calculates that in the decade after 1950, total state employment increased from 480,000 to nearly 800,000. So not just capture of the state institutions, but the wholesale massive expansion of the state institutions. And if we look at the population of whites within, I mean, even South Africa today, we talk about 7 million, which is roughly a number you can say at the height of apartheid. So a large section of those were incorporated into the civil service machine. Afrikaner males were the main beneficiaries of a large-scale process of bureaucratic organization, which included the creation of many new quasi-official state organizations and institutions. If Malan's narrow parliamentary majority restricted his ability to challenge constitutionally sensitive political rights, there was plenty of scope for government to press ahead on other issues. In 1950, the amendment to the so-called Immorality Act outlawing interracial sex was passed, extending the scope of existing legislation. Another significant piece of legislation passed in 1950 was the Suppression of Communism Act. Its immediate political effect was to drive the Communist Party underground. The Group Areas Act of 1950, which allowed the government to proclaim residential and business areas in towns and cities for designated race groups, including Indians and Coloureds, was also based on prior segregationist legislation. The group was extensively used to remove communities and individuals who found themselves living in the wrong place, most notoriously in the racially mixed and politically vibrant areas of District 6 in Cape Town and Sophiatown in Johannesburg. But not everyone resisted the opportunity to gain new housing. For instance, in Durban, many working-class Indians welcomed the opportunity to establish footholds in newly laid-out townships where they now paid rent to the municipal authorities rather than private landlords. A new departure, with no direct precedent in the segregationist era, was the Population Registration Act. This ensured that every child was assigned a racial category on birth. The measure was one of the foundational mechanisms of the growing apartheid state. It gave rise to the hated reference book, or the dumb pass, which Africans were obliged to carry and to produce on demand following the passage of the Natives' Abolition of Passes and Coordination of Documents Act in 1952. So having established that, we come to Verwoerd, who for many people is necessarily considered the architect of apartheid. And it's not just in terms of enumerating policy, but also you can say as a political leader. Without Verwoerd, it's very difficult to see how this structure, which had begun, I mean, all of those pieces of legislation which I mentioned were taking place in the early 1950s during the first premiership of Milan. It's very difficult to think that without a figure such as Verwoerd, apartheid as not just a policy, but indeed a system of preserving Afrikaner domination and white domination more generally in South Africa could have gone past the 1960s and could have survived decolonization in Africa and the winds of change speech. So going back to Dubow. Prior to Verwoerd's unexpected move to Native Affairs in 1950, the department was a political backwater with low visibility and lacking in prestige. E.G. Jansen, appointed Minister of Native Affairs in 1948 on the basis of his prior experience in the post under Prime Minister Hertzog, carried on in much the fashion of the segregationist era. He presided over a relatively decentralized administration, the senior ranks of which were largely English-speaking, and whose officers regarded native administration as something of a vocation to be practiced rather than as a tact or specialist art. In respect of labour, the Department of Native Affairs was reluctant to help farmers competing against mines and industry. If this meant intervening in the market to subsidise them, Jansen was immediately perceived as ineffectual by a rising group of Broederbond-affiliated experts on the native question who sought decisive action to end liberal muddling. He was duly relieved of his position and offered the government generalship in 1950, again explaining how, despite how powerful the position was in 1939 during the war, under the really, you can say the governor generalship was always an ornament during the apartheid era, which is why perhaps it was so easy in 1983, 1984 for Botha to simply abolish the position and establish the executive presidency. From the start, Verwoerd imposed a new regime in the native administration, transforming the department into a highly centralized bureaucracy and imparting a firm sense of direction. Scientific management and technical planning were all key aspects of his authoritarian statism. In this sense, he was more the master builder than the architect of apartheid. The top tier of English-speaking administrators was soon passed over or eased out of positions of influence. Afrikaans became the preferred language of communication. Verwoerd's Secretary of Native Affairs, Werner Eislin, did much of the foundational thinking. Like Verwoerd, he had worked as a professor at Stellenbosch University. Born into a Berlin missionary family based in the northern Transvaal, Eislin trained as an academic anthropologist. The vaunting vision of positive apartheid was, to a significant extent, his own. Eislin sought to restore African culture to an idealized tribal state. Separate education was chosen as an instrument to achieve this. This conception of apartheid as the fulfillment of ethnic destiny by ways of separate development was often in advance of Verwoerd's. Together, Eislin and Verwoerd used the Native Affairs Department to fashion the idea of apartheid into practical existence. In so doing, The outlying province of native administration acquired enormous powers and expanded rapidly until it became a veritable state within the state. Douglas Smith, a former Secretary of Native Affairs, was barely exaggerating when he described Verwoerd in 1953 as a Napoleon in native affairs who was trying to set up a great black empire under his supreme dictatorship. And by Great Black Empire, we're talking about the relation of the whites and the Bantustans. And indeed, you can say statism as a justification in itself, of course, was a springboard for Verwoerd to come into power. But statism also, in many ways, beyond an ideological conception of it, provided a continued justification for state involvement in the Bantustans, which is what he means by Black Empire. The Native Affairs Department had long been oriented towards the rural areas and the reserves, praising forms of indirect rule, geared to the maintenance of the tribal system. From the mid-1930s, schemes were introduced in the African reserves so as to improve agricultural productivity and combat environmental degradation. Under policies of reclamation or betterment, experts pressed the need for stock dipping and cattle culling, as well as fencing and contour terracing. More often than not, policies were not executed. As in other parts of the colonial settler Africa, conservationist ideas were often strenuously resisted by Africans as an unwelcome interference with livelihoods and ways of life. In the post-1945 period, environmental and social policies of the betterment increasingly focused on the economic viability of the African reserves, including the question of labor supply to the urban areas. This more comprehensive approach necessitated distinguishing between peasant cultivators and migrant wage laborers. Concentration of human settlement implied removing access to land for some people. With the advent of apartheid, or again, comparing on your view, you can say rather the consolidation or the formalization of apartheid, rural development in the homelands became tied ever more closely to a separate political function of these territories, as the 1955 Tomlinson Commission fully recognized. In the urban areas, the presence of the Native Affairs Department also became more conspicuous from the 1930s. Here, its narrow jurisdiction overlapped with municipal authorities and other government agencies in respect of labour, housing and welfare and the administration of justice. The consequence of this unsystematic approach was clearly apparent by the 1940s. The main concern of the Native Affairs Department in the 1950s, therefore, lay in gaining control of the urban areas and in responding to the perceived threats of oorstroming, of how do I exactly translate that? It's burying under or something like that. It's an accusation which was leveled at Hofmeyr in the 1948 election. The Native Affairs Department increasing intervention in the rural reserves reflected conceptions of the reciprocal relationship between rural development and urban planning. Managing the flow of labour from rural to urban areas was key to imposing apartheid as a coherent system. If the South African economy is imagined as a traditional egg timer with two bulbous parts at each end, the rural reserves and the urban areas, labour would have to flow through the narrow aperture connecting the two. This was precisely where the blockages in the system proved most acute. Control over the movement of labour was the weakest element of the pre-1948 system of segregation. It also proved to be the most intractable element of grand apartheid. Particularly in increasing coercive mechanisms were introduced to retard or even reverse the process of urbanization. Verwoerd, the apostle of centralized planning, moved swiftly to integrate all aspects of labour and urban policy under his charge. The Native Laws Amendment Act of 1952 revised a raft of already existing legislation affecting Africans in urban areas. This umbrella act now afforded state officials extensive powers of arrest in the case of Africans deemed to be idle or disorderly. It made provision for the creation of labor bureaus, which Africans seeking employment would have to register with. Section 10 made it illegal for Africans to be in proclaimed towns and cities for longer than 72 hours, unless they were born in the area, had lived there continuously for 15 years, or had worked for the same employer for 10 years. Residency rights could be lost if during this time an individual had fallen foul of the law. The Natives Abolition of Passes and Coordination of Documents Act of 1952 created the hated reference books, which all Africans over 16 and over had to carry and produce on demand to the Dompas. These measures formed key planks in the armory of influx control measures by which the state sought to regulate the labour market and limit Africans' rights to live in the cities and towns, in effect creating division between urban insiders and rural outsiders. To be sure, such legislation had precursors in the segregationist era, and by, just to emphasize what Dubow means by the segregationist era, really distinguishing pre-1948, so 1910 to 1948, or really you can say more specifically 1935 to 1948 vis-a-vis everything after 1948. But the segregationist era legislation was unevenly enforced and had increasingly fallen into abeyance, often with the tacit approval of the Smuts government. Apartheid aimed to reverse the lackadaisical implementation of racial segregation. What was novel in the Verwoerdian scheme was the attempt to intervene in the labour markets. Labour bureaus were intended to allocate labour to various sections of the economy, often in defiance of market forces. So you can say not only is this a form of population control, this is a form of economic management, you can also say this is a form of etatism or dirigism at the same time. In fact, all elements are subordinated to the policy of apartheid in the economy and movement and residence. From the 1950s, it became illegal for any employer to engage an African worker who was not officially registered as an official labour bureau office. By these means, it was hoped that systematic planning, overseen by an omniscient bureaucracy, would control urbanization in a rational and orderly fashion. The notion of a labour contract as something freely entered into by two parties was thereby fundamentally altered. In all these innovations, it amounted to a degree of demographic dirigism that had never been attempted. Yet by the end of the decade, it was becoming apparent that the labour bureau system was failing to achieve its objectives. Employers and workers seeking alike simply flouted the rules and made their own arrangements. The key to Verwoerd's efforts to integrate urban and rural initiatives and to exercise unprecedented powers over the individual person was the reference book, known as the Dompas, the idiot book or the Dumpas. This would link data concerned an individual's birth, race, residency, tribe, tax status, and employment status. The 1950 Population Registration Act made this theoretically possible. By the mid-1960s, a universal archive of some 10 million fingerprint records and photographs was maintained by the Central Reference Bureau, or the Bureau of Proof. This ambitious device constituted the heart of Verwoerd's ambitious biometric state, which was perhaps unequaled in scope by any country in the world at that time. Large-scale computerization began in 1966, and the major constraint to the successful issuing of reference books was not so much political resistance by Africans to registration as the near impossibility of marshalling the bureaucracy and managing the technology to complete the process in 18 months allowed for by Verwoerd. By 1960, when pass-burning protests by Africans eventuated in the Sharpeville massacre, the hopelessly clogged machinery of the Central Reference Bureau was probably less able to issue useful intelligence about its subjects than the earlier systems it replaced. So, after reading that, it's clear that apartheid, in terms of its implementation, in terms of actually rationalizing a system and using it beyond a education slogan, had essentially evolved into, well, again, it shouldn't exactly be surprising to us, all these references to the biometric state. Indeed, it's something which has been at the forefront, you can say, of political dialogue since the COVID lockdowns. So taking that, and you can say the logic, rational implementation of apartheid based around essentially a bureaucratic apparatus, I want to return to Kuyper and Irving Hexham, because this really should provide such a stark contrast between the two apartheids, or really you can say three apartheids in terms of Kuyper's explicit conception, Verwoerd's policy manifestation, and Malan's idea of apartheid having been a supreme reality which defined Afrikanerdom since the 17th century. So going back to Hexham and Kuyper. For Kuyper, the democratic form of government was the best choice possible, but he clearly distinguished his view of democracy from democratic theories based on the doctrine of popular sovereignty. That justification for democracy he replaced with his own Calvinistic theory of sphere sovereignty of God. To bring theology into politics, this was or may appear a convenient way of evading hard political thinking. In fact, however, Kuyper was attempting to base Christian political action firmly in Christian principles. For Kuyper, the sovereignty of God bore directly on human life and consequently on politics. The doctrine taught that God alone is the supreme ruler of men, therefore no man can rightly demand obedience from another. The authority of men over men is thus a relative privilege granted by God. Such authority is part of man's duty to serve God and his fellow men. You can say, again, sermonizing concept of Baskap, despite Stuardom's abhorrence towards such moralizing principles. Kuyper believed that sin alone necessitates government. By contrast, and you can say that's almost going back to the Hobbesian notion of the war of all against all. By contrast, doctrine, like those of popular sovereignty, imply that government is natural and that men have a right to delegate to other men the power to rule over them. This act of delegation gives rulers the right to demand obedience from their fellow men. It also forces those who question rulers' authority to obey them. Popular sovereignty thus creates a form of political life ultimately based upon sheer force, being devoid of all principle. It is thus unacceptable to the Christian. So if we conceive of a form of democracy, popular sovereignty, the democratic will, the idea of political life ultimately based on sheer force, again, this is why I bring back Kuyper and Fearford and the conception, because of course, yes, originally the bureaucracy essentially was, force through the pen, force through the sheer sort of magnitude and overbearingness of law. But of course, in terms of the evolution of that, especially after Sharpeville, we see the evolution of the bureaucratic mechanisms, the biometric state, into a broader conception of the security state. Kuyper argued that the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty limited such power and made possible political actions based upon principle rather than force. He explained his theory by saying, in the Calvinist sense, we understand hereby that the family, business, science, art, and so forth are all the social spheres which do not owe their existence to the state, and which do not derive the law of their life from the authority of the state, but which obey a high authority within their own bosom, an authority which rules by the grace of God, just as the sovereignty of the state does. This involves the antithesis between states and society. These different developments of social life have nothing above themselves but God, and the state cannot intrude here. With this theory, which Kuyper hoped would place a legitimate limitation upon government, he thought he had resolved the age-old conflict between church and state. In the past, the church had conflicted with the state. Now Kuyper pointed out the potential within society for equally important conflicts between state and various other social institutions. He also hoped to resolve these conflicts by giving each social institution its legitimate sphere of influence and restricting the state to administering justice. Having said this, Kuyper did not expect perpetual peace. Rather, as a realistic politician, he recognized that political life is constantly changing. Thus, he built conflict into the heart of his theory. Explaining his expectation of conflict, he wrote, "It is here of the highest importance sharply to keep in mind the difference between the organic life of society and the mechanical character of government. From this arises all friction with clashing, for government is always inclined, with its mechanical authority, to invade social life. On the other hand, social life always endeavors to shake off the authority of the government." There is a notion which everyone sort of on the right side of the spectrum, for lack of a better word, even though I rebel against that to some extent, has to deal with, which is essentially conservatism as we know it is dead, i.e. conservatism being attached to historic institutions, because all those historical institutions don't do essentially what they originally intended to do. Indeed, when we look at concepts such as the nation, monarchy, the church, all of these things are bound up in a conservative idea of the continuity of these representing facets of an organism. You can say organs, components of a body, which is the nation, or some sort of broader conception thereof or grouping. Now take a concept like that, and in terms of, you can say, trying to bring about a new sort of organism, in this case, this being apartheid, or the supreme reality, you can say, of Aya, of a Afrikanerdom, which is permanently separated from blacks, coloureds, and Indians. What Fairfield has done is to embody the mechanical character of government, which Kuyper ultimately detested. And you can say that this goes beyond ideology and this goes beyond Christianity, but this is apartheid essentially as a self-perpetuating mechanism for bureaucratic government and the expansion of bureaucratic government, hence the creation of the biometric total state. So the authority of social life has been undermined and superseded essentially by the authority of the government. Two apartheids, that of Kuyper and that of Verwoerd. So you can say that in many senses, Fairfield was a revolutionary, whereas someone, again, like Kuyper, was very much a reactionary. Someone like Malan may refer to apartheid as being a state of segregation that had existed in fact, based on many arguments dating from separate institutions to the lack of racial miscegenation. But Fairfield essentially tried to take this notion, this historical development, this idea, and turn it into an actionable policy based on a bureaucratic superstate. And as you can probably see, especially for myself, who has, I would say, more sort of openly libertarian leanings when it comes to the economy, it becomes something readily abhorrent. And indeed, you can say it actually becomes antithetical to conservatism in many senses. And ultimately, when I come back to the end of this conversation, I want to go back to Giliomee's idea of survival and justice, i.e., was the survival of Afrikanerdom sufficient to justify and perpetuate such a bureaucratic overreach and penetration into all aspects of social life, which under a Kuyperian conception of a Calvinistic system of separateness or ownness, each institution belonging to itself, has effectively been undermined here by the power of the state. But I want to go from here and to really expand upon this conception of what essentially the Bantu homelands and the Bantustans mean. So going back to Dubow, within nationalist policymaking and political circles, there was from the start a view that apartheid had to be presented as morally defensible, a system which would be advantage to all. This could only be sustained by insisting that the losses incurred by Africans in white urban areas would be made up by greater opportunities in the reserves. Christian national theory, folk nationalism, and cultural relativistic ideas, dawn from anthropological theory, all provide a justification for the idea that cultures were unique systems that merited special treatment or protection. It followed that ethnic and national units should be accorded their own separate channels for expression and perhaps even a measure of political recognition. This was the premise of the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act, which provided for the creation of tribal authorities in rural African reserves. It gave the government extensive power to proclaim chiefs and councillors, regardless of whether they enjoyed popular legitimacy. Elements of direct and indirect rule were thereby built into the system of government, which, although centralized in Pretoria, South Africa has three capitals, Pretoria being the executive capital, was devolved into rural authorities at a local level. Although not apparent at the time, the Act laid the basis of the future Bantustans, notionally self-governing tribal states whose emergence represented the apogee of the apartheid fantasy. Just emphasizing Dubow's term there. The 1951 Act was bitterly opposed by Africans who rejected government-sponsored retribalization, viewing this as a further erosion of their residual citizenship rights. Yet in dispensing power and patronage to favoured proxies, the legislation had the potential to attract some degree of support. Some of this had been foreshadowed by Verwoerd in his major 1948 speech to the Senate on the meaning of apartheid. Here, Verwoerd's assertion that South Africa was a white man's country and that he must remain master here was offset by a vague assurance that in the reserves we are prepared to allow the natives to be masters. This concession contained not even a hint of eventual independence for the Bantustans. It was introduced merely as a defense against accusations that apartheid was solely about domination. Total segregation might be fine in principle, but it was not practicable. At this point, Verwoerd's main contribution to the explication of apartheid lay in his ability to present existing government pronouncements in a manner that suggested overall coherence. And indeed, this is part of, you can say, the brilliance of Verwoerd as a politician. Yes, on the one hand, you can say he represented the essence of a bureaucrat in terms of working all of this out in theory, but he was also a very sort of eloquent ideologue when it came to addressing all of this and being able to reconcile the reality of the apartheid policy with all of the intellectual developments that came before it. Unlike, say, for example, a figure like Stilidom, which is why you can say Verwoerd was more of the natural successor to Milan, even though he didn't really have to be because he was already sufficiently powerful enough in native affairs. We should not be surprised by the absence of original ideas in Verwoerd's inauguration speech on apartheid. His intervention into public affairs in the mid-1930s was on the poor white question, a matter in which the Stellenbosch University professor of sociology and psychology could claim some expertise. As editor of Die Transvalve, the leading source of nationalist opinion in the North, Verwoerd was preoccupied with the campaign for Republican independence. This commitment he shared with his close political ally in the Transvaal, G.J. Stilidom, who saw the solution of the colour problem as a precondition for the attainment of a republic. It was only as Minister of Native Affairs that Verwoerd began to make apartheid his own. Apartheid was thus in no sense Verwoerd's invention, however, it became his creation, an emphasis on creation as in formulation of a policy, i.e. the apartheid era being associated with Verwoerd, if one is to distinguish 1948 to 1994 from, as Malan would consider, the whole 300-year span of civilization, indeed rebelling against Dubow's, say, for example, strict demarcation of pre-unification, segregationist era, and indeed ultimately relaying back this to apartheid era. An important dimension of Verwoerd's charismatic leadership was the manner in which he used force of intellectual logic rather than the motion to outwit his opponents, and in the process demonstrate that Afrikaners were fully the equal of English speakers. This was amply shown in his confrontation with Macmillan over the Winds of Change address in 1960. Achieving parity with the white English speakers in social and political terms was what initially brought Verwoerd into politics, which is why republicanism was so vital to his ambitions. The apartheid mantra was initially conceived as a means to achieve Afrikaner parity and indeed to supersede the white population, i.e. the British population, though it increasingly became identified with the project of white supremacy involving the British and the Afrikaners as a whole. The more grandiose aspects of apartheid have much to do with Verwoerd's personal ambition and the way in which he used his position in the Native Affairs Department to carve out a personal political empire. Again, I can't help but feel, I mean, we're talking about the erosion of Westminster norms, and we're talking about, say, for example, the demise of the more sort of formalized conception of cabinet government, which I think is exemplified by Botha's creation of the executive presidency, which really is unique in terms of a constitutional structure, not just in Africa, but in the world. It's not semi-presidential, but it's not fully presidential either. To take this, you can say that I've talked about the various ideological influences, and indeed, you can say the cauldron of story or the leaf mold of the mind, always referring back to Tolkien in terms of creating the well of ideas which essentially created the policy of apartheid. I think as elements of that, of course, are indebted to National Socialism, which played on the mind of many Afrikaner nationalists during the war, it's also important to consider that you can almost say that Verwoerd captured the state by becoming a supreme bureaucrat, in a sense. And you can say that this is sort of symptomatic of what we see with Albert Speer's identification of the National Socialist political system in Germany, that there was simply a situation of competing castles. It wasn't enough, say, for example, for Goering to head one department. He had to control, say, for example, economic affairs in the 4-year plan. He had to have the Luftwaffe. He had to have his own military battalions. Even Ribbentrop, as a foreign minister, had to have his own battalions in the war and things like that, in terms of building up consolidated positions. Verwoerd, as an intellectual, as a capable, charismatic politician, and as a bureaucrat, was able to build up his own power base, which essentially became the building of apartheid, effectively became the building of Verwoerd's own political career, which you can say is in many parts the justification as how it was able to consolidate and last so successfully, despite universal sort of outside condemnation. But just to further expand upon the concept of the Bantustans, and before I forget, because I have been a bit remiss in moving my slides, the most hubristic aspect of high apartheid and grand apartheid are various concepts that Dubow refers to extensively in terms of the overall chronology of the development of apartheid. And again, going back to the title, Career of a Concept, the many iterations of apartheid, how the idea and then the implementation may achieve, the greatest level of pedanticism, or on the one hand, sophistication. High apartheid, again, you can say represents more the utopian aspirations of it. On one hand, I talked about utopianism being referred to in the foundation of Afrikanerdom as acknowledging apartheid as a means of breaking down the Tower of Babel, going back to Tyrtaeus. But here you can say that, as with many socialist and bureaucratic schemas, and indeed looking at like the economic interventions in the state with like a Stalinistic 5-year plan, that the Bantustans effectively represent the apartheid policy version of that. In other words, an attempt to engineer utopia via state social engineering, which was essentially what I believe Dubow is trying to elucidate with this idea of high apartheid, and ultimately, as all utopian projects are concerned with ultimate hubris, because inevitably they will fail. At the level of official policy, apartheid ideology evolved from the pronouncement of white domination, Baaskap, to an elaborate and obfuscatory ideology of multinational development. Verwoerd himself signaled the shift to a positive apartheid by insisting that separate development should replace the odious term apartheid. Is that, just trying to think, I've never seen that word before. Anyway, I think odious is how I've often seen it before, unless that's a typo. In practical terms, crude repression remained ubiquitous, not least because the scale of social engineering needed to achieve separate development could not be achieved without compulsion and force. For those caught up in the criminal justice system by not carrying their passbooks, for Africans removed from white farms and white urban areas, or for servants contravening the orders of their masters and mistresses, bureaucratic compulsion remained an everyday reality. Separate development was not so much the antithesis to Baaskap as its ideological antidote. Someone in the chat is saying different words. Well, thank you. Like I said, I've never seen that word before. It was touted by Verwoerd as a way to reduce everyday racial friction by normalizing separation and providing an outlet for African political ambitions. In 1959, promotion of Bantu self-government, which made provision for African self-determination in separate homelands or Bantustans, signaled a momentous change. It dispensed with the old assumption that the Bantus were a single homogeneous people, and instead envisaged the creation of self-governing African territories, supposedly based on historically determined ethnic or tribal grounds. You can see what I mean on the map on the top right here. Just prior to the announcement of self-government for those living in Bantu homelands, Secretary of the Bantu Administration Department, Werner Eislein, presented what he called the harmonious multi-community development as a local adaptation of the British Commonwealth model, with white South Africa playing the part of the mother country. The issue of eventual political independence was treated cautiously after the possibility appeared on the legislative agenda. Now, what I think is meant by Eislein
and the idea of the Commonwealth model. Effectively, if we look at the British Empire is defined by a system of heterogeneity, i.e., there was a mother country, a white mother country in the case of the British Isles, and a system of local competing protectorates and colonial administrations throughout the empire, all of which have a distinct relationship with the mother country, if I'm trying to sort of expand upon that idea. Again, interestingly enough, referring to the idea of the British Commonwealth, again, even though we're talking about this idea of Afrikanerdom rebelling against the British, lingering here due to the indelible aspect of the British, the settlement, the constitution, the relationship, the dominion, the monarchy, all of these things you can see are creeping into the political vernacular of what was conceived of by the Broederbond as state capture by the Afrikaners. The bold new plan, which was neither presented to cabinet nor discussed beforehand by the National Party caucus, again indicative of the power of the Native Affairs Department, held out the promise of sovereign independence for the homelands. This radical revision of policy was prompted by the hope that white South Africa could wrong-foot its external critics by mimicking decolonization elsewhere in Africa. Initially, 8 such national units were proposed, though their number eventually proliferated to 10. The first Bantustans to be accorded notional independence was the Transkei in 1976. 3 others followed. Minister of Bantu Administration, Devet Nel, introduced the new measure to Parliament in terms of God's divine will and desire to every folk to realize its own cultural destiny. Secular doubters and the outside world alike were assured that the future homelands were analogous to the new African states that were gaining independence elsewhere in Africa. Throughout the apartheid era, the government insisted that the homelands would satisfy the political, which is to say the tribal ethnic ambitions of Africans, in a bid to legitimize their sovereignty. The homelands were never recognized internationally. The South African government indulged the homelands with grandiose schemes and symbols designed to underlie their nationhood, as well as to flatter the apartheid fantasy, again, Dubow. And I hate to say fantasy, I prefer the word utopianism because I think it has better connotations in terms of identifying the bureaucratic political quagmire in terms of political implementation. Because really, in terms of the prospects of the Bantustans, I want to come back to this towards the end because I think it comes to an interesting historical counterfactual. The minimum specifications for homeland interdependence included a flag, football stadium, airport, parliament, and army, in addition to an authorized tribal lineage. Optional add-ons might include a casino for daily cross-border visitors from white South Africa. A further bespoke marker of Bantustan identity came in the form of FM radio. From the 1960s, the Official Broadcasting Corporation expanded its long-standing provision of services in English and Afrikaans with new short-range FM services tailored to different African language groups, beginning with isiXhosa, isiZulu, and isiSotho, and thereafter extending to other language communities. For rural as well as urban listeners, Radio Bureau offered easy and relatively cheap anodyne entertainment. By 1970, when almost the entire population had access to FM radio, around 3 million Africans were reportedly tuning into these tribal stations. They had the added advantage from the government perspective of dissuading blacks from turning to potentially subversive AM and shortwave broadcasts emanating from neighboring states. In this manner, apartheid ideology penetrated the realms of leisure and domestic life. Broadcasting a message is, of course, not quite the same as receiving it. As Jacob Giliomee reminds us, instead of narrowing expectations, radio may well have opened up the imagination by exposing listeners to a wide world than broadcast controllers intended. In addition, black announcers seem to have been able on occasion to subvert official surveillance by exploiting subtleties of language and meaning. It is unlikely, however, that these exceptions negated the broader propagandistic effort of Radio Bantu, which sought to promote a calming paternalistic picture of happy and harmonious rural-based separate development. In its quest to simulate tribal awareness and legitimize the homeland system, Radio Bantu could be seen as one more example of the prescriptive cultural relativism that was seen so central to apartheid ideology. Again, apartheid ideology, onus necessarily involves a system of cultural relativism, i.e. the blacks can never be assimilated into a white-dominated Afrikanerdom or more broadly conceived of white South Africa due to this fundamental
cultural relativism, and again, the idea of re-tribalizing the Africans. It's quite interesting to consider because in the grand scheme of decolonization, one charge that is always leveled at the colonial administrators in Africa is the fact that the borders of Africa, take, for example, Kenya or even Nigeria as an example, aren't reflective, you could say, of historical or ethnic realities. They are instead colonial contrivances. So, in a sense, you can say the Bantustans are effectively the same. They are an attempt by the white South Africans, to contrive top down various identities. However, they're actually taking on board some of the criticisms of, say, for example, the creation of a state of Kenya or Tanzania, etc., in the sense that they are actually trying to re-tribalize these areas. They are trying to identify these separate tribes and cultures, and they are trying to create homeland states out of them. But in terms of going back to this idea of Baskap or mastery, if you look at the map on the right, one of the charges, obviously, is that kind of like the Indian reservation system in the Americas, despite being the vast majority of the population, blacks were only given 13% of the territory. The fact that they had to be disassociated with their black citizenship. And of course, if you look at these units again, you also have to say that many of these units aren't continuous. They are blocked off in little parts, which make access the pass laws even more difficult, given the stringent measures, including, difficulties with labor access, residency permits, and all those sort of things, which again were endemic to the biometric state in South Africa. If these states are relatively small, you are essentially having an ascribed nationality put onto you by the South African government, but these states aren't even continuous. In fact, they are kind of like Swaziland and Lesotho. They are entirely contained within the whole sort of superstructure of South Africa itself. And part of the, you can say, political justification for that is, if you, like on the east, you see all these clusters of Bantustans, the danger essentially in allowing them to have large continuous states which link up that territory is later in apartheid in the 1970s. This is all during the time of the Portuguese Empire. If you link these up to other potential African states, then they can essentially become militant states within your borders. So breaking them up, almost making it impossible to govern without nominal South African suzerainty, can be seen as this larger concept, effectively a Baskam. And as Chester Donnelly in the chat is saying, yes, they look very similar to the West Bank. In many ways, essentially, this is a means of permanently dominating a racial group essentially within South Africa to ensure that the fundamental security of the South African state isn't compromised, which is, it's not controversial to say, that's incredibly akin to the Israeli situation. Obviously, the Israeli parallel to South Africa is rather stark. The main difference between South Africa and Israel being the international, in particular the American perception of such governments. So continuing onwards, the Dutch theory of pillarization, which entailed the vertical separation of social, religious, and public institutions, was one historical source of this institutional division, and its precepts were encapsulated in Christian national ideology. From the mid-century, it was given a new social scientific banking through the anthropological discipline of Bantuology. Supported by African universities, Bantuology was expressly designed to invest the new ethnic homelands with scientifically approved national traditions and to train officials in the principles of governance. Notwithstanding their common training a generation before, by the 1960s, English and African-speaking anthropologists operated in entirely separate professional and institutional spheres. Much the same goes for history and other disciplines in the social sciences. Hence what I mean by top-down national sort of reorientation and conception. So this isn't apartheid, so to speak, in terms of identifying ownness, because what ownness essentially is being created here by Fairford is an ownness which has been imposed on them by the white administration within Africa. And indeed, this idea of retribalization, this idea that we are going to reject this idea of a common Black identity within South Africa, which doesn't exist today. And we are instead going to recognize that there is an idealized state for the blacks within South Africa, and it is within the conception of this broad academic discipline of Bantuology, which, if you remember from those of you who have watched the Rhodesia stream, is the complete opposite of the Rhodesian ideology of gradualism towards black majority rule, or at least the ostensible idea of gradualism towards black majority rule. But of course, for Ian Smith, that was countered based on the idea that in order to be civilized, one needed to be ideologically dedicated to the Rhodesia project. And of course, invariably, that proved to be completely impossible as a gain, because most educated Africans then became socialists like Mugabe. So going from there, we're going to the crisis of apartheid. I've already mentioned the fact that Verwoerd, through his bureaucratic superstate, was able, despite it being incredibly unlikely, to sustain the system for a relatively long time and against significant outside and internal stress. In 1960, there was a mass demonstration, it's already been referenced, of approximately 7,000 protesters in the township of Sharpeville in response to the Don Pass, the pass laws. It is still contested to this day, despite featuring as part of the broader Mandela mythology. In fact, the site of the massacre is actually, I think, just made a UNESCO World Heritage Site just to emphasize its importance. As to whether the protest was ultimately peaceful or violent, nevertheless, South African police opened fire on the protesters and ultimately killed 69 people. The Truth and Reconciliation Committees that were set up after apartheid fell in 1994 would later find that the response was due to police inadequacy and a breakdown in discipline than an intentional premeditated response by the authorities. But nevertheless, the massacre precipitated a domestic and international crisis, and only 6 weeks prior, Macmillan had delivered his Winds of Change speech, delivering the whole tempo of British decolonisation in Cape Town itself. So going back to Dubow. For a brief moment, Sharpeville rocked the government. Huge quantities of foreign capital were repatriated overseas, the gold price and the stock market fell sharply, and the finance ministry was forced to take strong measures to protect against a deterioration in the government's reserves of balance of payments. Stairways momentarily paralysed commercial and industrial activity in the major urban centres. The prospect of serious economic decline and the certainty of international isolation prompted alarm, bordering on panic, throughout white South Africa. A state of emergency was declared in all the country's major urban areas, as well as many rural districts, giving the police sweeping powers of arrest and detention. Parliament voted in favour of banning the ANC and PAC, citing the alleged revolutionary objectives. By the middle of May, some 2,000 political leaders and activists, including Lutulu and Sobukwe, were taken into custody under the emergency regulations. In this febrile environment, some radicals ventured to hope that the government might collapse. Other leaders, like Oliver Tambo, prudently left the country in order to establish an exile presence for the ANC. Some figures with the ear of government press for a permanent revocation of the pass law and a process of cautious reform aimed at stabilising the urban black population. Expressions of moral confusion within Afrikanerdom were abundantly evident when 11 leading theologians of the 3 Dutch Reformed churches contributed to a reform delayed action, which cast serious doubts on apartheid's theological foundations and called for a new outlook on racial attitudes. One contributor, Albert Geyser, was sacked from his professional position at Pretoria University and convicted of heresy. A Dutch Reformed minister at Krugersdorp told his congregation after Sharpeville that bullets and imprisonment could not solve the native problem. He was pressured to resign. At the end of 1960, the World Council of Churches convened the Koslow Consultations in Johannesburg, a landmark ecumenical gathering of the anguish of Sharpeville, which united in rejecting unjust discrimination, though not necessarily apartheid as a whole. Verwoerd took these criticisms seriously, and in his 1961 New Year address to the nation, he warned dissident churchmen that they were speaking without the authority of their synods and congregations. So I know this concept is a Catholic concept, essentially, but I do think it actually bears mention here, the fact that the Dutch Reformed churches, as indeed they were part of the ministry of Milan, as they were part of the Calvinist conception of apartheid, as we talk about Kuyper and the Dutch Calvinists, You can say that the Reformed churches, the synods, the ecumenical councils, in many respects, effectively are a form of Calvinist integralism with the apartheid system. So rather than listening to the ANC or black advocacy groups, Verwoerd, when he sees opposition from Calvinist ministers, it really is rocking the moral bedrock, essentially, for apartheid. And I'll come back to this when it comes to the idea of survival and justice. There has to be a moral justification for the continuation of apartheid. It cannot be seen domestically to be a system of pure aggression and essentially totalitarianism or authoritarianism. And so when Verwoerd, of course, being incredibly conscious about these, you can say, ideological underpinnings of the apartheid government, looks to this, sees this as a test of fundamental legitimacy, not just in terms of apartheid, but in terms of the continuation of his political career. And he deals with this very seriously. And indeed, you can say the maintenance of power of the Reformed churches take this so seriously, to the point that they actually convict some of their own members for heresy in terms of rebelling against the apartheid era. So fundamental is this relationship essentially between the national state, between the National Party, the executive premiership, the Reformed churches, and the system of apartheid. So how does he take things from here? On the 9th of April, the day after he outlawed the ANC and the PAC, Verwoerd's composure was further tested when he delivered a speech at the annual Rand Easter show in Johannesburg, culminating in the peroration, "We shall fight for our existence and we shall survive." At this point, a wealthy English farmer with a long history of mental disturbance, said to have possessed by a violent urge to shoot apartheid, but with no clear political affiliations, mounted the platform and fired 2 bullets into the Prime Minister's face at point-blank range. Extraordinary, Verwoerd survived, and he was back in active politics less than 2 months later. While Verwoerd was incapacitated, the acting Prime Minister and representative of Cape Nationalism, Paul Sawyer, caused serious ructions in the party by calling for a new approach and suggesting that the events of Sharpeville had closed the old book of South African history. The air was thick with rumours of a coalition government, but Verwoerd ended all speculation when he announced from his hospital bed that he would not change course. For the Prime Minister, the disturbances were only underlined the necessity to complete the process of apartheid. If anything, the attack on his life strengthened Verwoerd's resolve and extended his mesmeric authority over the National Party. Once back in active politics, he moved quickly to repress the reformist impulses evident in the opinion-forming circles like Sabra and the Dutch Reformed churches. The state emergency was lifted. At the end of the tumultuous year, Verwoerd announced that the government's colour policies would have to be defended like the walls of granite. Far from deflecting the government from the Republican cause, which had been the article of faith of Verwoerd well before he took up the cause of apartheid, Sharpeville brought this prospect closer. At the start of 1960, Verwoerd made the unexpected announcement that a referendum would decide the vexed question of whether South Africa would become a republic. His move was interpreted by some as an effort to shift attention away from his increasingly unpopular apartheid policies. There was even doubt whether Afrikaners were sufficiently united behind the idea to win the vote. The referendum was duly held and scheduled in October, indicating the government would not be deflected from its course. During the referendum campaign, Verwoerd made concerted overtures to the English-speaking electorate and used the political crisis, as well as the bloody civil war which broke out in the newly independent Congo, to undermine the imperative of unity in defending white supremacy. The pro-Republican campaign slogan, "To unite and keep South Africa white," amply reflected fears of black domination and lessened long-established ethnic rivalries. Sufficient English speakers were convinced of this argument to endorse the Republican proposal with a yes vote, narrowly, of 52%. The narrow margin of victory indicated that by no means all Afrikaner speakers were constituted more than 55% of the white electorate voted with the government. Some must have opposed the Republic, perhaps because of fears of international economic isolation or out of residual loyalty for the British monarch and existing constitutional arrangements, see Jan Smuts and Louis Botha as examples. But English speakers were shifting their allegiances. At the 1961 general election, the National Party significantly strengthened its position and won a majority of votes for the first time. One of the factors in this victory was the support of the government of English speakers responding to the call of national unity. The Republican campaign did indeed reveal that English-speakers South Africans were far less wedded to Britain and the multiracial Commonwealth than they had been a generation or more before. It also demonstrated the government's willingness to expand insular Afrikaner nationalism to a greater defiant white nationalism. A symbol of this shift was token inclusion in 1961 of 2 conservative English speakers in the cabinet. More significant was the decision to abandon efforts to restrict white immigration. At first, Wessels was prepared to retain South Africa's membership of the Commonwealth, but under pressure from member states insisted on the Declaration of Principles and included criticism of apartheid, Wessels withdrew South Africa's membership application. On its return to South Africa from the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting on 20th of March 1961, Wessels was welcomed by tens of thousands of adulating supporters as the leader of the white man in Africa. Air Force jets roared overhead. Wessels declared that his withdrawal from the Commonwealth was a victory, not a defeat. For many of his supporters, this was indeed Wessels' finest hour. He had turned the long divisive issue of republicanism into a unifying position of apparent strength, and thereby realized the twin-pronged aim of 1948 Apartheid Manifesto: white domination and Afrikaner dominance. From this moment on until his assassination in 1966, Wessels enjoyed a more complete control over cabinet and country than any South African leader before or after. To compound this, we have the Rivonia trials. In response to Sharpeville, the ANC had been banned. In the period of consolidation that followed the banning of the ANC's organized paramilitary wing, the Spear of the Nation, under Nelson Mandela and funded by one Arthur Goldreich of the Communist Party, though Mandela was arrested a year before the organization was discovered and disbanded. In the subsequent Rivonia trials, 11 prominent members of the Communist Party and the ANC were sentenced for incitement to violence, industrial disruption, and sabotage. Despite the assassination of Wessels in 1966, he was stabbed to death in Parliament by a Greek Mozambican called Sfafendas. Consolidated or high grand apartheid reached its ascendancy under Vorster until major cracks started to emerge in the 1970s. So essentially all the names you can say of Baskup on the other, which is why domination had been achieved. And indeed, if we're going to look back to this conservative notion, or rather sort of Dutch reactionary notion of anti-liberalism and anti-British imperialism, then the causes of republicanism and Dutch republicanism are all synonymous with this, which is why Wessels was an ideologue for republicanism, as, again, you can say an aspect of apartheid. But of course, the irony of this is to actually confirm the element of Baskup, of bossmanship, because in forming the Republic, leaving the Commonwealth, in rejecting essentially the notion of one man, one vote, which had been essentially the policy of decolonization, and the reason why Rhodesia would go down the route of the unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965. All of these elements helped to create, again, despite the massacre at Sharpeville, a consolidated sense of unity around Wessels in taking South Africa onto a brave new course, not just in terms of the bureaucracy, the expansion of the state, the whole redefinition of how the state deals with the population in terms of the creation of, you can say, the apartheid total state, but also in redressing its role in international relations. After this, South Africa becomes far more isolationist and, you can say, defiant in its role of a separate system. One thing that keeps South Africa relevant in this grand scheme, and this is actually identified within the Rivonia trials with the arrest of Arthur Goldreich, who was basically considered the ringleader and funder of the ANC, is the idea that South Africa will remain a bastion against communism. And indeed, you can say the necessity of South Africa fulfilling this role in terms of the scheme of decolonization and the interest of the Soviets in the Third World is going to keep South Africa related to the West in a way that Rhodesia is completely sort of cut off. So we don't begin to see a systematic total sanctions regime placed in apartheid up until the Gorbachev era of perestroika, which is interesting enough to consider. So all of this again is, and even then, I believe the role of sanctions is actually overstated in terms of undermining apartheid.
kind of like what we see with Russia today. Actually, the policy of sanctions further increases that notion of internal consolidation and, you can say, fortress mentality, isolationism, that the entire world is against us, so we need to bandy together. Such was sort of Fairfoot's coming sort of political realization in the Republic in 1961. And ultimately, such a policy existed very briefly in the 1980s, albeit Vorster himself had led, you can say, the policy of appeasement towards the black nationalists and towards, you can also say, the communists, depending on, you know, whether you believe Ian Smith on the Rhodesia question. So how do we go from here? And how do we understand essentially the crisis of confidence? Because as I've tried to explain, there is a fundamental contradiction within the policy of apartheid. It is at once trying to encapsulate a permanent sense of Afrikaner ownness, Afrikaner distinctiveness, Afrikaner exceptionalism. It is also trying to appeal to this whole notion of Baskap, this idea of mastery, and that the separate developments of black peoples within South Africa will be defined essentially by the government-sponsored disciplines of Bantuology. And yet, because you can say of this religious principle of Ea, and then you combine it with the formulation, the political formulation, the totalitarian, dirigismic formulation of apartheid, as you can understand within the concept of Afrikanerdom itself, there is a huge liberal pushback. And I go back to Giliomee, as I reference various times in the stream, and I want to come back to the end of apartheid being very much an internal affair in terms of the loss of confidence, the loss of legitimacy, and the loss of self-justification for the principles of apartheid. And I begin this by talking about Giliomee and his reference to one Van Wyck Lowe. Van Wyck Lowe rose into prominence in the 1930s as the preeminent Afrikaans poet, playwright, and national popular critic. His writings in this decade were influenced by the Afrikaner nationalist movement, which sought to capture power by mobilizing against British cultural imperialism and advocating apartheid as a policy designed to secure survival for Afrikaners and even more so for whites. Lowe's play, The Higher Right, was a justification of nationalism in view of the suffering of Afrikaners had experienced in their long history. His essays, Loyal Opposition, propagated a Volkskritik from a position of solidarity with the nationalist movement. In 1950, Lowe left South Africa for 8 years to occupy the chair of study of South African literature, history, and politics at Gemeentelijke Universiteit of Amsterdam. Although still deeply committed to the welfare of the Afrikaner people, Lowe now wrote more from the periphery of the group. The influences brought to bear upon him were quite unlike those to which fellow writers were exposed in South Africa. In post-war Amsterdam, there were above all traumatic comings to terms with the Holocaust, which wiped out the greatest part of the Jewish community in the Netherlands. There had been the impending fall of the Dutch colonies in the Netherlands East Indies, the East Indies in 1948, which had been founded before the Cape Colony. There was also Buber's visit to the Netherlands in 1946, which attracted great attention. Buber's theme that Israel must be redeemed through righteousness was one that Lowe would have grappled with within his own context. In 1950, Lowe published 5 seminal essays on the theme of culture and crisis in the popular weekly De Heergesnot. A perceptive Jewish commentator, Henry Katsu, called 3 essays the highest Afrikaner thought on survival. He endorsed the review of Piet Chile, editor of the daily newspaper supporting Die Burger, again the outlet which Fairfoot had written for. Chile described Lowe as an intellectual midwife whose essays contain the most important ideas, reflections, and doubts that in recent years have been working within earnest South Africans, but particularly nationalist Afrikaners. This judgment was correct, for in decades to come, no serious debate about survival would take place in Afrikaner circles without at least a ritualistic bow to Lowe's essays. Writing in its immediate aftermath of the NP's momentous victory in 1948 National Party and the introduction of the first apartheid legislation, Lowe identified 3 times of Volkskrisis,
situations in which the very existence of the ethno-national group was at stake. When the Afrikaners were overwhelmed by external military might or ploughed under by mass immigration, which was propagated by some pro-British politicians, Lau was referring to the Boer Wars. When a great number of the Afrikaner people doubted in themselves whether we ought to survive as a folk. Afrikaners may still survive individuality, and some may even prosper, but they would no longer constitute a distinctive folk. They would be absorbed into either an Anglo-Saxon or a Bantu-speaking nation, this idea of the deprivation of air or ownness, of distinctiveness. When some time in the future, a great number of our people would come to believe that we need not live together in justice, Lau's emphasis, with other ethnic groups, when they come to believe that mere survival is the chief issue, not just existence, hence why Fairwood put so much emphasis in terms of the creation of the Bantustans, that apartheid is a positive program. Indeed, one of the expressions he used was not of strictly apartheid, but of the preference for the term good neighborliness. Lowe argued that for a folk which was small in number, like the Afrikaners, the challenges posed by the second and third crisis were as severe as that by the first. In the second, but more particularly in the third crisis, the response of intellectuals was of particular importance. If a folk yielded to the final temptation of preferring mere survival as opposed to survival and justice, the withdrawal of allegiance of a critical number of intellectuals could have fatal effects. Lowe posed the question: it is possible for a small folk to survive for long if it becomes something hateful or something evil for the best or outside its ranks. Lowe did not despair of the hope that ultimately ethnic survival could be based on moral values, as Lowe phrased it. I believe that the greatest, almost mystical crisis of a folk is that in which it is reborn and re-emerges young and creative, the dark night of the soul, in which it says, I would rather go down than survive in injustice. Lowe insisted that he did not seek survival and justice alone along liberal democratic lines. While not rejecting liberalism as such, he argued, along with the most prominent liberal thinker in South Africa, Alfred Hornley, that the application to South Africa of European liberalism was problematical because it had its roots in countries with a homogeneous racial ethnic composition. By applying it uncritically to South Africa, Lowe argued liberals were hostile to the other right because full democracy meant an equality reach over the dead body of a whole folk, i.e. the Afrikaners. And if the Afrikaners became a powerless minority, they would become as helpless as the Jew was in Germany, hence enumerating a rather awkward situation between Jews, Zionism, and South Africa. Indeed, the Dutch suffered more than most when it comes to the German occupation during the war. Obviously, the Dutch relationship with the Afrikaners is essential, not just in terms of linguistic and historical, but also in terms of the intellectual formation, the pivotal role of Kuyper, for example, but also in terms of Zionist foreign policy goals and that of South Africa as well. Despite the fact that many Jews were associated with the Communist Party, South Africa has, you can say, a love-hate role with Jews and with Zionism in general. So moving on. For Lau, then, the South African drama was a classic conflict between two rights, Afrikaner and African nationalism. He used the words black and white nationalism. Nevertheless, he rejected the solution which called for the abandonment of either liberalism or nationalism. Despite the polar tensions between two principles, they belonged together and constituted the texture of South African history. The stalemate between the two nationalisms would be resolved one of two ways, either through the ploughing under of the less numerous groups, or the separate development of the different groups. Lau stated, for nationalism to be based on a true principle, it has to be everywhere and for everyone. According to the recognition of the nationalist principle for Afrikaner, logically has to imply the recognition of all other national groups in South Africa. Hence, we should not speak of ourselves as a nation of South Africa, but as one volk of South Africa. Hence, the idea of pluriformity. And again, the irony, which Irving Hexham really brings up, this idea of the irony of apartheid, meaning a diminution and departing from South Africa. South Africa is the absurdity. South Africa, in terms of a broad, consolidated electorate, in terms of a multifaceted democratic project has to essentially allow for the separate development of each of its groups. You can almost say that, as with Iceland's Commonwealth idea, which was inspiring the Bantustans, you can almost say the whole structure of the Afrikaner structure here is almost Ottoman, seeing this as Rhea or as millets. It is not difficult to see that this scheme of thought could lead to the full-blown apartheid ideology, which held that liberal principles of freedom and justice were accommodated by a policy of separate homelands for Africans and separate freedoms for whites and Africans. Lowe's essays of 1950 were one of the first publications from Afrikaner thinkers to use such concepts as separate development and multinationalism, derived from the political context of Europe, which in the 1960s and 70s would become euphemisms for apartheid. Hitler correctly posed the dilemma of a plural society in which the political loyalty of the large mass of the population was not to the transcendent nation or state, but rather the specific ethno-loyalty or racial group. Of course, when coming to an Ottoman system, you can look at this and say all fundamental allegiances are to a higher power. In the case of the Ottomans, it is to the Sultan or Padishah, the king who is master of all. In terms of, you can say, the missionary zeal of the Calvinists, you can say that one unifying figure, which would actually, you can act as a buttress to sovereignty under God, or Kuyper's original distinctive idea, is allegiance to Calvinist Christianity. But of course, even within the subset of whiteness being British Afrikaner, that is also absurd when one thinks of the prevalence of the Anglican institutions within the church as well. So there isn't even a united Christian conception. And indeed, in terms of using this as some sort of overarching justification for a transcendent nation of South Africa really is to talk about fantasy and utopianism, as has been discussed this evening. The African nationalists believed that in Verwoerd, who became prime minister in 1958, they found the leader who would provide both the political will and moral basis for a policy geared towards long-term Afrikaner survival. Verwoerd soon managed to persuade his followers that the power which his government wielded was right not only for the Afrikaners, but also those other peoples in the country. He conceded the right to throw stones to those whose conception of morality held that everyone should have complete equality. However, anyone who did not stand for absolute equality should qualify their judgment. The question then became not simply whether the policy was moral towards blacks, but also whether it was moral towards whites. Verwoerd had little doubt that the Afrikaner and larger white survival should prevail over rights. Every nation has the right to self-preservation and self-protection. If that nation at the same time exercises the right in such a way that it uplifts the other people and protects them from disorderliness and disease and destruction, and educates and takes care of them, then it need not do so in a way that constitutes a threat to its own survival. For Verwoerd, the state's first moral obligation was to ensure Afrikaner survival. And in this sense, you can say that Verwoerd was ultimately a success in terms of being able to culminate the policies which had been brought in 1948 and result in consolidated apartheid, high apartheid, the leaving of the Commonwealth, the establishment of republicanism, and indeed you can say the creation of the bureaucratic and security apparatus which would allow apartheid to sustain itself in power up until the crises of the 1970s, and this coming to the failure of the Bantustans. The cornerstone of apartheid had always been the policy of separate homelands, and again this is all from Giliomee's argument on survival and justice. In the apartheid scheme of thought, the homeland served three functions. They enabled Africans to enjoy separate freedoms, justified socio-economic discrimination against them in white South Africa, and increased white security by deflecting and splintering African political aspirations. Despite the discrimination inherent in the policy, the government hoped to win international recognition and diffuse external pressure on apartheid. The world community did not initially reject the idea. In a discussion with Verwoerd in 1961, the General Secretary of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, described the requirements which had to be met if the government wanted the homelands to be considered a competitive alternative by the world community. And by competitive alternative, we talk about the general policy towards one man, one vote and decolonization. Sufficient and coherent territory for the homelands, rapid economic growth and industrial development in these areas, recognize the human rights of Africans working in the common area and remove any compulsion for them to return to the homelands, and require the government to permit the homelands to proceed fairly rapidly to full independence. In the 2 decades following this conversation, the government made it only too clear that it was not interested in meeting these requirements. I don't necessarily say they're not interested in meeting these requirements, but rather it was effectively impossible. It was a task which the bureaucracy wanted to achieve, and I think Fairford, in terms of his Napoleonic status as creating the Black Empire, would have only been too happy to achieve. And even so, it was actually far more expensive to administer the policies in the Bantustans, as opposed to denying effectively Black participation in the economic systems within broader South Africa effectively. So I wouldn't necessarily, there was no interest in meeting these requirements, rather that the whole nature of dirigism within apartheid actually made it fanciful, if not impossible. There was no attempt to increase the allocation of the homelands beyond 13%, which had been laid down in 1936, when the government had been more limited in political and ideological functions for the homelands in mind. Far from recognizing the human rights of urban Africans, the national government now used the homelands as a pretext to justify the repatriation of surplus Africans and to deny African claims to South African citizenship and nationality. Now, this is the interesting counterfactual to consider. As I've shown on this map, the whole sort of basis of the geographic entities, the Bantustans, essentially they were designed to fail effectively. The only way that these states could continue a sort of separate existence was by their dependence on this notion of Baskap, of the boschship of South Africa, which, like I said, had a load of security implications in terms of all of these nations becoming separate. But it's interesting to consider if the claim of the 13% demarcation of land, of course, if you're looking at this more systematically, you do not see the tribal identities. Rather, you see everyone as being South African, black, white, Indian, colored. And then you consider the sort of Mugabeistic allocation of land and land redistribution, then surely 80% of the land should be given over to blacks. That is the democratic, more socialistic justification for this. But nevertheless, there is an argument to say that, as you can see on the map on the right here, that the territorial situation for the Bantustans was always insufficient, and it was insufficient by design. In fact, the irony, of course, is that for all the innovations of Fairford's apartheid legislation, the key component of the legislation demarcating the territory itself was not changed within the apartheid period. So perhaps if they genuinely wanted international recognition, or were trying to achieve this new commonwealth within the black states of South Africa, one way to achieve it would have actually been to cede a much larger segment of land and create continuous units in. But of course, in terms of looking at this from the perspective of the security state, the more land you confer to these territories, the more you concede a decentralized political structure. You might necessarily weaken the Native Affairs Department. Like I said, the whole nature of these things seems to actually augment the power of the South African state, centralize it rather than lead to a process of decentralization. In fact, in order to allow for the Bantustans to reach full fruition as independent, continuous nations, it would necessarily involve, you can say, a fundamental change of thinking within the entire apartheid superstructure towards decentralization rather than centralization, which of course was the achievement of Fairford. So it's an interesting counterfactual to consider. But as you can probably see, as I'm trying to explain, the whole logic of apartheid actually creates these groups not as pathways to independence, but eternally dependent entities on the South African bureaucracy. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the development of the homelands was largely neglected. Fairford's prohibition of investment by white entrepreneurs in the homelands constituted a severe blow to growth. Between 1960 and 72, a total of only 85,000 jobs were created in the homelands and border areas, well below the 50,000 new jobs a year, which the Tomlinson Commission had considered necessary. Indeed, Fairford ignored many of the provisions of the Tomlinson Commission. The government resettlement policy further impeded development. Apart from the rapid natural population increase between 1960 and 1980, the homelands had to accommodate 2 million Africans, 1 million removed from farms, 600,000 from black spots, 750,000 from white cities under the policy of township relocation. The effect on the homelands was devastating. whereas the average population density in the homelands between 1918 and 1950 was 50 to 60 per square mile. This had doubled to 125 by 1970. Between 1970 and 1980, the overall population of the homelands rose by another 57%, the result of massive inflows of people from a dramatic decline in agriculture production. The homelands became overwhelmingly dependent on the earnings of migrant labor. So another aspect you can say of real nation-making is the achievement of autarky. But when your entire economy is outsourced, again, you're crippling the notion of independent Bantustans to begin with. Thus, the separate ethnic development which Afrikaner nationalists once held out a positive vision, by 1970 had become threadbare. World criticism and the diplomatic ostracization of South Africa continued to mount. If in the mid-1960s, Pierre Chilier, editor of De Burger, could ask how it came about that the Afrikaner nationalists, the first anti-colonialists of Africa, and of course they're referring to the Boer War and the struggle against British imperialism. Of course, the idea that the first anti-colonialists of Africa were white, of course, is very inconvenient, were now in themselves in the courtroom dock, charged with being colonialists and oppressors themselves, hence the irony, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist colonialism. Chilier had hoped that the idea of separate freedoms for the various ethno-national groups would become an irresistible idea, comparable with the principle of equality in the American Constitution. By 1970, Chilier had become despondent. Bantu homelands are the essential cornerstone of our ethnic relations policy over the longer term. They have fallen by the wayside in our focus of interest and belief, which in turn undermines our credibility. We must imbue our policy with idealism and urgency, or else our future will become pitch dark. From the beginning of the 1970s, the NP tried to find a new legitimating ideology for its policies to replace the homelands. Willem de Klerk, brother of the politician F.W., who the last Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa, was most prominently associated with this attempt to enunciate a new legitimizing universalist principle. Rejecting integration, he stated that the alternative was not perpetual discrimination but equality and diversity. However, diversity here meant state-imposed classification of the white-coloured Asian and black groups, and there was no evidence of a move towards equality in state spending on social services and distribution of other resources. The positive idea of separate freedoms that Chilier wanted to project had become fatally blurred, as the discriminatory nature of the separate development was starkly revealed. Between 73 and 76, white rule suffered serious blows. In the Durban strikes of 73, black workers for the first time flexed their muscles in a massive illegal strike. Black trade unions had effectively been all but banned in South Africa. In 1974, the Portuguese buffer states of Mozambique and Angola collapsed, the continuation of the Portuguese Empire, and then these states effectively devolved into communism and civil war with the Cuban incursion into Angola, which itself was the justification for Vorster's, for lack of a better word, rapprochement, appeasement to try and basically jettison Rhodesia as an international pariah. The Soweto uprising of 1976 signaled the beginning of a broad-based black resistance. To survive in the changing political environment, the National Party government developed a series of new responses. The 1977 White Paper on Defense encapsulated the belief of the security establishment that the country faced a total onslaught on virtually every area of society. The Botha government, which came to power in 1978, broke with the past and openly seeking the support of English-speaking captains of industry to strengthen the state and persuade the African working class to see the political and economic order as legitimate. The Botha government also vigorously sought to attract black allies, trying to co-opt them to consultative structures and to induce them to govern their own communities and help administer the state. To facilitate this, the government produced explicit white privilege and symbolic domination, Baskab. State security and development imperatives began to take precedent over narrow ethnic concerns. The period between the mid-1970s to the 1980s saw the narrowing of the racial salary gap. In the civil service, the ending of statutory job reservation and a commitment to equalize spending on white and black social services. The dramatically changing external environment and internal balance of forces injected a new vigor in the ongoing debate about Afrikaner survival. Different responses can be discerned. The right rejected all adaptations of the apartheid order. The ethnic splinter, the HNP, founded in 1968, was followed by a large breakaway in 1982 when the Conservative Party, under the leadership of André was formed. its support amounted to Afrikaners jumped from 19% in 83 to 41% in 92. The CP ejected as much as the MP's alliance with English capital, which traditionally was branded as Hogenmeyer's, as its liberal racial policies. As an editorial in the CP's mouthpiece, The Patriot phrased it, a party, once described as the political national front of the Afrikaner, is now visibly associated with the traditional enemy of the Afrikaner, namely the Hogenmeyer, to form a relationship against fellow Afrikaners. Such a relationship can destroy the ways of the Afrikaner folk, and again, this ironically is something that began as a precedent with Verwoerd himself. And indeed, you can say the explicit aim originally of D.F. Mullen, which was to run in 1948 as a centrist and disown the more radical anti-English, anti-Republican elements within the National Party. Effectively, the National Party becomes a catch-all, which can then rally around the policy of apartheid, which originally was very nebulous and ill-defined and more as a sort of cultural phenomenon. Treuenicht, who became leader of the Conservatives, emerged as their main ideologue. In the classic apartheid way, he argued that it was not in conflict with the will of God for a folk to maintain its own identity and pursue a separate identity in its own territory. The Afrikaner mainstream in the National Party, on the other hand, accepted the fact that major reforms had become necessary for survival, even if that meant sacrificing some democratic freedoms that whites had enjoyed. Shortly after coming to power in 1978, Botha declared that political challenges were such they had become a matter of adapt or die. In terms of expanding upon what these political measures are, this is the last segment I'm reading from Dubow, which he identifies the Botha era as neo-apartheid. And I have an image on the right here, which is explaining the very sort of convoluted system of the Constitution, which he established in 1983-84. Just give me a second. By the end of the 1970s, apartheid ideology was transmuting into what Posers called a language of legitimation. The depoliticized discourse was seemingly capable of incorporating a range of interests and ethnicities in a united front against an insidious enemy. In promoting national survival over Afrikaner ascendancy, hitherto core elements of the folk were pushed into the margins, the white working class, large parts of the rural platteland, as well as the Verwoerdian true believers. This shift in the demographic patterns of power eventuated in a right-wing split in 1982, when the mild-mannered and articulate, but altogether intractable ideologist André Treuenicht led a breakaway from the National Party to form the Conservative Party. The loss of the right posed more than an electoral threat. It was also an existential danger that permeated the whole Afrikaner establishment. For Botha, the split had the compensating advantage of allowing the government to position itself at the centre of the white political spectrum. The problem was that Botha, and indeed most of his party, remained unable or unwilling to think of himself out of the apartheid mindset. A bewildering vocabulary in which trusty old formulations were mangled together with neologisms, with rapidly cobbled together in pursuit of a new apartheid solution. This begged the question as to whether the government intended to reform apartheid or merely reformulate it. The ontological centrality of the population groups remained fundamental to neo-apartheid. Minorities were presented as the essential building blocks of multicultural plural society that would be subject to a yet unspecified form of power sharing. The Christian national conception of AE, which connotated deep emotional attachment to the soul of the folk, was anglicized into own affairs, denoting constitutionally protected spheres like education and culture, which will continue to be subject to the jurisdiction of defined groups. Neo-apartheid's theories were ever keen to lend respectability to their ideas by referring to the international political scene. The concept of consocialism, again a very convoluted word, I think you need to have a few hyphens there, enumerated by the Dutch-born American political scientist Arend Lipjart, was widely studied among conservative reformers. Lipjart repaid the compliment by writing a book, power sharing in South Africa, which laid out suggestions as to how to form a conceptual form of democracy, which would be constructed with constitutional institutional provisions for minority ethnic groups. It was criticized both for its acceptance of ethnic differences as a matter of unalterable fact, and also on account of its spuriously scientific approach. Efforts to change the discourse of apartheid frequently bore only a tangential correspondence with reality. Piet Koolhof, the reform-minded Minister of Cooperation and Development, bombastically announced to the Washington Press Association, "Apartheid as you know it is dying." He went on to pledge, "We will not rest until racial discrimination has appeared from the statute books of everyday life in South Africa." For a brief period, the powerful ministry responsible for the administration of blacks, over which Koolhof presided, became known as the Department of Plural Relations. It was left to the Sunday Times to clarify the absurdity. It's official. A Bantu is not plural, even though he may have some plural relations. Christopher Hope, a wry observer of the debasement of language under authoritarian regimes, noted that South Africa is a land where euphemism has long been like war, an extension of policy by other means. Koolhof's tantalizing promises were received skeptically and caused uproar amongst die-hard right-wingers. In 1982, a package of legislation was introduced after an extended process of drafting and redrafting. Far from helping in the process of normalizing race relations, as they were supposed intended to do, the proposed measures imposed unprecedented community councils on blacks in urban areas and outlined draconian measures designed to tighten up influx control, thereby enforcing the distinction between black insiders and outsiders. The proposals added more complexity to an already bewildering administrative regime, drew attention to the continued role of the Bantustans as repositories for unwanted labor, and confirmed that those territories were the only places in which Africans could exercise political rights. Anti-apartheid activists termed these measures the Koolhof Bills, and the name stuck. The Black Sash organization warned that if passed in its existing form, it will be the most efficient form of influx control this country has ever experienced. P.W. Botha's long-awaited constitutional proposals entailed replacing the Westminster system of government with a tricameral parliament, featuring separate chambers for whites, coloureds, and Indians. A president's council drawn from the three chambers would advise the executive state president. The constitutional proposals were eventually passed by a large majority in a whites-only referendum in 1983. This marked a short-term personal victory for Botha, but the cost was that the opposition on both ends of the political spectrum was mobilized. It was the vexed matter of power sharing that finally provoked Troyanic's long-expected right-wing split from the National Party. Just a note on the referendum as well. The key sort of motivating factor for the no vote in the 1983 election was Rhodesia voted yes. Of even greater significance was the effect of the new constitution on the vast majority of the population. In attempting to entice coloureds and Indians into the political process, the constitutional arrangements highlighted the exclusion of Africans from South African citizenship. Limited political incorporation for some was no substitute for the loss of political rights for South Africa's majority. Concessions merely drew attention to what was being withheld. The ever more complex array of legal exemptions and exemptions associated with the implementation of the Black Local Authorities and Orderly Movement and Settlement of Black Persons Bill revealed the capriciousness of rulers and bureaucrats in their pursuits of ever more complex and unworkable policies of divide and rule. Botha's constitutional changes and reforms precipitated a full-scale crisis of government legitimacy. Machiavelli was familiar to thinkers with an ear to the president, but the more obvious parallel was de Tocqueville's reflections on Louis XVI and the French Revolution. Experience teaches that the most critical moment for bad governments is one which witnessed their first steps towards reform. Never had the feudal system seemed so hateful to the French as at the moment of its proximate destruction. In the case of South Africa's popular masses, the common rallying cry was wholesale abolition of apartheid, not merely its reform. Now, I'm going to end tonight's discussion by finishing off the article from Giliomee. But as you can situate, as with Milan and the way he positioned himself in 1948, Botha, again, contrary to, I'm sure many of you are, I'm not, but I'm sure many of you were alive in the 1980s and perhaps even remember some of the international press coverage from Botha. which was, obviously seeing him as some sort of, apartheid maniac. But nevertheless, within the context of Afrikanerdom, I mean, like, he was a very, very contentious character. The Conservative Party split effectively caused him to lose not a majority, but a significant minority of Afrikaner support. And indeed, he was trying to broaden the conception of South African identity to include non-white groups, as you can see on the image on the right here, coloureds and Indians. So bear in mind how anti-miscegenation had been such a core component in terms of the ideology and racial purity of the South Africans. And then you see essentially that once the concession has been made by P.W. Botha, you can see essentially how it opens the floodgates to more demands for reform. Because even though it may not seem very significant that a few MPs are now coming from the Indians and the coloureds, of course, the minute you begin to adopt this idea essentially of a recontextualized identity for South Africa, and indeed you're sort of undermining the whole notion of the Bantustans as well, the cause for reform becomes inexorable, which is why it's not surprising that talks with Mandela begin during the P.W. Botha period. So back to Giliomee. The Soweto uprising of '76 and the resurgence of black political protest in the 1980s moved the debate over different strategies for survival into the mainstream of Afrikaner politics. By now, almost all the best Afrikaans writers and poets and many academics have become alienated from the cruder aspects of apartheid. Several writers address the issue of Afrikaans language of survival, the most tangible cultural manifestations of the Afrikaner people. These writers argued that the very policies of government threatened Afrikaner survival by contaminating Afrikaans through its association with apartheid. Jan Rabie charged that apartheid alienated the Afrikaner youth and drove the coloured people into English arms of black nationalism. Other writers contended that what made Afrikaners different from colonial people was the fact that Afrikaner language was a multiracial achievement, developed originally from European settlers, slaves, and Quaker people, such as the lingua franca. Hence, Afrikaners and Afrikaans would have a right to survival only if it remained true to multiracial history and heritage. And again, you can perhaps see this quite extensively in terms of Botha's radical redefinition of what is essentially meant to be South African with this constitution. A quite different note was struck by the poet Breyten Breitenbach, who lived in exile in Paris and was jailed in '75 for 7 years for entering a country on a clandestine mission. He emerged as the most radical, vociferous, and eloquent Afrikaner critic of the establishment survival thinking. Breitenbach did not subscribe to the central concern of the debate over survival, namely whether Africans and Afrikaners could survive after apartheid. As Volzer points out, Breitenbach, like Camus in the Algerian case, saw his people as Africans who are in Africa to stay. And of course, when Camus was writing, he was talking in the context of the Pied Noir, French whites, and the Berber and Arab Algerians in the context of the Algerian War of Independence. Unlike Camus, however, Breitenbach strongly believed the problem was people staying could only be solved within a black socio-cultural field of reference. Afrikaners were a bastard people with a bastard language whose destiny was to decompose in order to rebind in new forms. The overriding priority was not survival of securing individual rights in a post-apartheid, but the realization of one South African cultural identity composed of an incredibly rich variety of sources and expressions. Breitenbach excoriated the Afrikaners who had defined themselves exclusively as white European and allowed for greed to be rationalized as survival, developing a tribal ethos of negation, suppression, and withdrawal. And again, you can almost argue that this is sort of pure oikophobia. Yet for all his outrage, Breitenbach did not become totally alienated. As Lowe had demanded, Breitenbach, as a critic, shared the shame of his people. What exists in the country has been perpetrated in R in my name and R in my language, he wrote. He added that I cannot and will not disassociate myself from this mess. In 1986, he wrote that the critic can only be effective when he speaks in his language, his land. His prime task was to develop a new awareness among his people of what was being perpetrated in their name. The stringent criticisms of Breitenbach and other Afrikaner writers were the backdrop against which the linguist Jaap Steen returned to Lauw's theme that the future of the Afrikaners would be at risk if the folk became something evil in the eyes of their own intelligentsia. Steen discounted the possibility that a negative self-image could objectively be the result of insufficient achievement by the Afrikaners. The problem, he argued, lay with the interpreters. The great danger was no longer that Afrikaner intellectuals would neglect to object to injustice, but that the process of correcting what was wrong, they could write off the Afrikaners, and in the process of criticizing Afrikaner errors, they would do it so mercilessly the younger generation will hesitate to identify with the Afrikaans culture and their people. This was too much for André de Toit, a philosopher from the University of Stellenbosch. In his book The Father Sins, which took as its motif Lauw's third threat to survival, de Toit correctly called it absurd that Afrikaner intellectuals could be suspected of any excessive zeal in exposing the injustices of apartheid. For de Toit, the problem was rather that the moral crisis of exclusive Afrikaner power, embroiled as it was in a system of racial domination, was becoming ever more acute, and Afrikaner youth faced the prospect of an endless military struggle without a convincing rationale. Yet Stein had a point. If the criticism was single-mindedly focused on what was evil and hateful, why would people listen? And could such criticism not be counterproductive? Would it not lead to either strengthening the conservative claim that nothing could be gained from reform, or their claim that no basis existed for peaceful settlement or capitulation? As Michael Walzer remarked in a general context, criticism is only heeded if the critic is seen as connected to one of us. To this someone, like Breitenbach, might reply that the policy of apartheid did give Afrikaners a hateful stigma, and the time had come to debate the Afrikaner survival outside of the context Lauw had suggested. It was left to the Stellenbosch philosopher, Johannes Degenaar, author of a book on Camus and essays on Lauw and various aspects of moral philosophy, to provide the analytical framework to which the concern for Afrikaner survival could be reconciled with the desire for a just political system. In the spirit of love, Degenaar attacked chauvinistic ethno-nationalism, but held open the possibility of an open plural society in which individuals and ethnic groups could coexist peacefully. His most outstanding essays appeared in his book Survival and Justice in 1982 and in Coming of Age and Being an Afrikaner. He introduces Immanuel Kant's perspective on the Enlightenment, which he sees as a process of liberation from immaturity to one in which a person could critically review his presuppositions and structures which would not pass the test of morality. Degenaar rejected both the liberal model, which spoke only in individualistic terms, and denied the possibility of individuals becoming mature as Afrikaners, and the nationalist model, which thought only in terms of ethnic structures, and believed individuals could only become mature within the fold of the folk. Instead, he chose a pluralist model, which allowed for the possibility that individuals could attain adulthood as Afrikaners. Degenaar contended that identity was not God-given, but the product of voluntary identification with the group and its values. Attaining adulthood did not mean becoming alienated from the Afrikaner group, but did represent a form of assessment of obsolete Afrikaner idioms and an opportunity to renew one's membership in the Afrikaner people creatively. That meant choosing values in history of one's group which could pass the test of fairness and morality. It also meant thinking in moral terms about survival. It was necessary to take justice, rather than the sovereignty of the folk, as the yardstick for politics, and to seek cooperation between whites and blacks on the basis of negotiation, not consultation. What would a just political order look like? Degenaar did not elaborate on this, but made it clear that this was the final test. This was justice. A creatively renewed Afrikanerhood in changed conditions means choosing not mere survival, but survival in justice, which was the essential condition for physical survival. Much of the debate over the 1970s and 80s took place in a context in which white domination looked unassailable, but this world would not last. The years 85 to 86 constituted a political watershed. Resistance to apartheid had reached the point where the government was compelled to declare a state of emergency. Suddenly, the political future of Afrikaners and the Afrikaner culture looked uncertain, as Love thought it was in 1950. Three positions with respect to Afrikaner survival now emerged. On the right, there are about a third of Afrikaners who believe that only continued domination would secure survival. A section of them entertain the idea of a much reduced Afrikaner homeland. To the left, a position crystallized which was best articulated by Slabat, who became leader of the Progressive Federal Party 10 years after he left the University of Stellenbosch. Although his party never attracted the support of more than 5% of Afrikaners, Slabat remained an influential voice in Afrikaner intellectual circles. For Slabat, the debate about the political future of the Afrikaners and Afrikaans was survival and justice, a mere abstraction, unless a settlement was negotiated with the majority. A book, South Africa's Options, which Slabat co-authored with David Walsh, was not particularly sanguine about the prospects for democracy in South Africa, yet it posed the challenge to whites to break out of the condition of siege and negotiate pacts with leaders of all representative movements. The third position which emerged was the NP leadership vision of a sharing of power. I have de Klerk and Mandela here as perfect encapsulation of that. This fell short of the demand for a genuine liberal democracy, but recognized the need for a negotiated settlement. In the course of the 1980s, the idea of negotiations won through among the Afrikaner and larger white elite. A survey conducted in 1989, before the ban against the ANC was lifted, among a broad spectrum of the elite, found that over 80% thought that a mutually acceptable settlement between whites and blacks was possible in South Africa, that negotiations were a feasible method of resolving the conflict, that the ANC had to be one of the negotiating parties. The negotiations did not entail bargaining, only about the transfer of power. So what has essentially been demonstrated here is that from the conception of 300 years of apartheid to the utopian religious conception of a separate Aya or ownness for the Afrikaner people, to this constant victimhood, oppressive narrative that we see with the occupation of the Cape Colony, with the Boer War, and the creeping internationalism and prospect of, again, you can say a gradualist route to decolonization and black majority rule under Jan Smuts. Again, I'm using decolonization within the broad spectrum of Africa, not just referring to South Africa, given the anti-colonialist and, again, derogative of colonialism applied to Afrikaners. All this essentially is to represent that there had to be some religious, moralizing, legitimating impulse for apartheid. What Fairfield ultimately achieved was the consolidation of this broad, more abstract aim. You can say a fundamentally sort of intrinsic aim to the Afrikaner mindset, which was that of separate capture of a nation, essentially of sovereignty, if onus is to represent something, not just sovereignty, but cultural distinctiveness. Verwoerd was able to take that and implement it into a policy of complete sort of overarching, comprehensive dirigism into all aspects of social life, making apartheid essentially an indispensable factor of South Africa, not just a metaphysical element as Kuyper would have wished. And indeed, as we look at the schism within the synods and the Reformed churches in the 1960s, and Verwoerd's fear, essentially, that he was going to lose the support of the churches, that moral legitimacy needed to be buttressed behind this hard policy of bureaucratic apartheid by the legitimating principle of positive apartheid, not just the domestic ordinance, and to be able to sustain a sense of Afrikanerdom, not just in terms of a population voting for the National Party, but also, as Love demonstrate, this idea of an intellectual cohesion in defense of Afrikanerdom, and indeed trying to present the Bantustans as an example for the international community, i.e. this is the Afrikaner version of decolonization, albeit the irony, of course, as I tried to explain, that the whole basis of the Native Affairs Department and the expanding bureaucracy meant that the centralization and state-mandated institutions, Bantuology, effectively necessitated that these organizations would always become dependent, not dependent. Effectively, these were promulgated, top-down imposed identities which are being fostered onto the Bantustans. And of course, the more internationalist and members of the ANC, of course, considered themselves to be South African, and they weren't to be re-tribalized and adopt essentially this very intellectual, but also you can say very patriarchal, paternalistic, again, as we see with FM radio and the whole sort of a conception of state policy and propaganda being used to justify and perpetuate the system of Bantustans. Of course, as we see by the 1970s, the system of legitimation was failing. And Botha's own attempts at reform, being able to expand the notion of what it means to be South African to appeal to colours and Indians, of course, was a radical measure, but it was also an insufficient measure, as Dove correctly identifies by bringing Tocqueville, that Louis XVI was a relatively benign figure, yet he also became the figure of public hatred, and ultimately he was decapitated. All of this is to say that as moral legitimation was such a component of apartheid, the minute that positive apartheid, or good neighborliness, in Verwoerd's words, began to retreat, and the more you have this emphasis on the expansive security state, international condemnation, and in 1986, the Congress of the United States overrules a veto by Ronald Reagan supermajority to impose economic sanctions on South Africa. Originally, they allowed for, you can say, continued resistance against the international community, but in the end, the more business community, you can say again, the tragedy from the class warfare, working class roots, and you can say Broederbond origins of the National Party, is that de Klerk ultimately represented the interests of business, in a sense, the interests of the white middle classes. In a sense, they wanted not only to prevent continual anarchy, but they wanted to open South Africa open to international business again. And so hence why so many working class, more convinced members of apartheid were drawn instead to this idea of the Conservative Party. So all of this is essentially to consider that a large part for what I believe the demise of apartheid, as Giliomee has elucidated by talking about various figures going on from Love, is the minute that apartheid itself became cancerous, the minute it became associated with evil, the more it became an indictment against the Afrikaner population, because apartheid as a political system, as an extension of the security apparatus, the necessity for more oppressive measures, and again, the international condemnation, you have to consider that even if you again believe you're on the right, the whole notion of a siege mentality when you are effectively a relatively small nation and small population cannot endure indefinitely, as we saw in the case with Rhodesia, even though, Ian Smith again was committed to a transfer of power, but ultimately Ian Smith wasn't able to achieve a Mandela situation, the fact that he was outmaneuvered by Mugabe. What I will argue here is, even with the delegitimation of Verwoerd's conception of apartheid, i.e. apartheid is a bureaucratic instrument as a biometric total state, which was undone by the Afrikaners themselves. It was the Afrikaners who dismantled apartheid, not Mandela. Mandela was a key figure in understanding the National Party and its transition towards majority rule, and then Mandela became the focus of the Rainbow Nation. But it was this loss of confidence, the idea of the denial of survival and justice, that Afrikaners believed that they were becoming something morally abhorrent, the loss of legitimation, that led essentially for de Klerk to be able to realize the abolition of Verwoerd apartheid, of grand apartheid, through the referendum. But I will argue in terms of understanding this within the context of South Africa today, and again, I'm very much an outsider looking in, is that apartheid obviously is used by the ANC to justify more radicalizing measures of integration, to accuse, in a very sort of socialistic and communistic mindset, that all of the inadequacies when it comes to our nation building program are all a result of the legacy of the corrupt capitalistic pre-existing system. This is something that is endemic to all communist regimes, and part of the creation essentially of a communist utopia or socialist utopia is the idea that one has to delegitimate the previous foundational historical settlement and create a year zero. So in many cases, 1974 is seen as the year zero for South Africa, but as Mandela wanted to reconcile and even had de Klerk in his first cabinet, as the ANC project has moved on, it has become more focused on this idea of seeing apartheid essentially as responsible for all our ills. So we need to confirm this idea of year zero. We cannot account for anything of this legacy of apartheid. But the irony, of course, is even though apartheid as a bureaucratic superstate apartheid as Baskap, as domination, as bossship of whites over blacks is dead, definitively dead. I believe apartheid, in terms of looking at this grand vision of 300 years of, and now it's what, nearly 400 years of Dutch and later Boer settlement, has not died. Rather, as the bureaucratic and Baskapist elements have been shorn of the apartheid ideology, what is left is actually something which isn't so riddled with contradictions. It's actually something purer, which is this notion of Ea, which I've referenced, the idea, the soul of the folk. And obviously, the idea of the Rainbow Nation, I think it's fair to say at the moment, if it hasn't failed, it's definitely dying, and it's beginning to go towards, say, for example, a Zimbabwe situation, which we may see in the next sort of 2 decades. But if you look at examples such as Orania and the moves towards Cape independence, what the notion of apartheid and separate Afrikaner and white identity has essentially evolved into is this notion of essentially the first solution, which was mentioned here when it came to the conservative solution, which is we must retain a section of continued separate identity or homeland, even if that be radically reduced. So we go from the map on the right here, with the white lands representing the white South Africa, and we reduce it to a tiny little hub like Orania, or we reduce it to the West Cape. And even within that conception, we talk about coloureds and Indians still being integrated into the system with a large black population, but ultimately where whites and coloureds represent a plurality over blacks as in the rest of South Africa. So the reason I think this is interesting is not for the derisive ways in which the modern ANC demonizes apartheid, and as you can probably see, that Verwoerd's apartheid was only effectively sustained by his charismatic personality and his ability to essentially appeal to a moralizing mission. But once the moralizing mission went, and ultimately all that was left was the repressive police state, apartheid became repellent to everyone, including the Afrikaners, apart from a very, an increasing minority of people who wanted to retain the Afrikaner system. So what is effectively left is what was there before, which is Ea, the idea of ownness and the desire for Afrikaners and whites in South Africa in general to capture their own self-identity, to retain a cultural distinctiveness, and ultimately to attain some level of sovereignty. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'll quickly go over the super chats and then I'll get out of here. Right. TL for $20. The Dante videos were fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Underappreciated, and there will be more Dante videos. I still have to go over Purgatorio and Paradiso, so thank you. You will be getting more Dante content. I particularly enjoy the video on Dante's De Monarchia because that's my speciality, so to speak. Unoriginal username for £10, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm at work, but great to see you streaming again. God bless you and everyone watching. Well, I have been streaming now for about, 6 weeks, 2 months, but lovely to see you again, and thank you for the super chat. James Borges, thank you, AM. Well, thank you very much for your £5 super chat. Andy, what is the basis for Cecil Rhodes' homo allegations for €2? I don't really know anything about that, I'm afraid. Andy, I'm not a biographer in the sense that I really chronicle personal things, apart from if they're like politically pertinent. So sorry. David Tomasek for €5. I don't have a question, just wanted to donate. Well, thank you very much. Well, for the next 5 minutes, you are going to have to ask me questions. Otherwise, I'm going to be leaving. I can't believe after nearly 3 hours and 45 minutes, no one has a question for me. Surely. Come on. Come on, chat. Don't let me down. All right. Unbelievably, there aren't any questions, so I'm just going to say thank you. All right. Would there been a way to engage and modernize from the West? Been a way to gauge? I don't really understand that question, John. Not real name. Can you reformulate that?
The Boers have a day of covenant and oath to keep every December the 16th holy when they pray to survive the Battle of Blood and Ron. That's, I think, another thing when it comes to the idea of a retrenched idea of South African identity or state, or Afrikaner identity and statehood, and why it didn't fly, is going back to Trotius and the poetry associated with the Great Trek and the founding of the Transvaal. Of course, the Transvaal was far more densely populated with native Africans than it was with Boers and white settlers, as you can see on the map on the left here. So it's very interesting that there is such an emotional attachment to the territory, and indeed the capital is based there in Pretoria and the largest city in Johannesburg. But all of this is basically to say that even though the ethnic situation doesn't necessarily lead itself conducive to the sustaining of a white-dominated territory, in those, you can say, core elements, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, that is part, you can say, of the national mythology around the Boers. That would mean it would be very difficult emotionally to divest themselves of those regions in like the 1980s. Right. Has John Not Real Name reformulated this question? Sorry, I punted that one above. I mean, diminish the segregation, but not let what happened in Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa. I mean, in the Cold War milieu. Sorry, I still don't really understand that question. Diminish the segregation. Well, like I said, P.W. Botha tried to diminish the segregation. But as I was also trying to get to with the Bantustans, the whole logic of the Native Affairs Department and how Verwoerd ultimately came to power entailed the expansion of the bureaucracy and the centralization and top-down administration of the Bantustans. The whole notion of African identity, except for example with Inkatha and the Zulus, was mandated effectively from above. So I really don't see how greater sort of levels of desegregation could be possible after the Botha model, other than a massive land retrenchment away from the east into the west and reconsolidation around the Cape. But like I said, there were major, ideological and spiritual connections to those territories, which I think even today make it almost impossible for white South Africans to disinvest themselves from feeling that that is part of their homeland. Isaac Gusev, is this guy praising apartheid or admonishing it? I can't tell. Well, that's the whole point of an objective analysis, isn't it? By the way, in case people are clear, appraising doesn't mean praising apartheid. Appraising means analyzing or assessing apartheid. I'm not going to change the title if people don't understand what that means. Right. Why is it not pointed out that the Bantus are not native to South Africa either? Because that, Charles Rose, that very much depends on how you're defining South Africa. And like I said, the issue with South African identity is that it was basically founded on anticlimactic absurdity, which was the aftermath of the Boer War and a sub-imperial contrivance by Lord Milner. Could South Africa have fared differently if they went for the Israeli solution? The reason South Africa couldn't have gone for the Israeli solution is that fundamentally there are fewer Afrikaners and whites vis-a-vis blacks in the case of Israelis and Israelis and Palestinians, but also consider that South Africa had the tentative support of the Reagan administration, whereas Israel, since 1968, has had the emphatic support of all levels and all parties. It's basically a uniform position in the United States to support Israel and all it does, and that's still very much the case today. So if that had been the case for South Africa, I'm certain South Africa under apartheid would have survived, but fundamentally that is what distinguishes Israel from South Africa. When Botha was speaking of agents of evil, he was almost universally talking about communists and terrorists. Steve Vanyan. Right, more super chats. Emil Microroya, what is the near future trajectory of the Boers? I'm afraid I'm not on the ground enough to tell you. Apart from my musings in regard to talking about this as some sort of grand historical arc of AO and apartheid, I can't really speak to specifics. There are a lot of
South Africans, sort of mutuals and things like that, you can talk to Robert Duigan, for example. It's quite good if you want to learn more about the domestic situation in South Africa today, and someone who is far more directly invested than I am. Horowitz, Feinberg, and Horowitz for $20. No AM, we just wanted to hear you. Well, thank you very much. And Iron Duke has basically asked the same question, given the same response. Check out the actual South Africans. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening. I'm amazed that my voice has survived all this time. I'll likely be seeing you again with more Dante videos. All right, good night.